Imagine a corroded bronze device, no larger than a shoebox, pulled from the wreckage of an ancient Greek merchant ship that sank over 2,000 years ago near the island of Antikythera. This artifact, discovered in 1900 and won by sponge divers working off the coast of Greece, would eventually challenge everything historians believed about the technological capabilities of the ancient world. And yet, for decades after its discovery, it remained largely ignored and misunderstood by the scientific community. The mechanism consists of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears of varying sizes, meticulously crafted and arranged within a wooden frame, their teeth precisely cut to mathematical specifications that would suggest an understanding of mechanical engineering far more advanced than scholars believed the ancient Greeks possessed. When researchers finally began to seriously study this object in the early 2000s, using advanced imaging technology including X-ray computed tomography, they discovered that this device was designed to predict astronomical positions and lunar phases decades into the future, functioning essentially as an ancient computer that could calculate the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy. The mechanism appears to have been used to determine the dates of Olympic Games, to forecast lunar eclipses, and to track the positions of planets, suggesting that whoever built this instrument possessed not only mathematical knowledge, but also a sophisticated understanding of gearing ratios and mechanical advantage. Yet the most striking aspect of the Antikythera mechanism is not merely its existence, but rather how it vanished from human knowledge and capability for nearly 2,000 years, as if the technological prowess required to create such a device simply ceased to exist after the Roman period, leaving no archaeological evidence of similar mechanisms or the intellectual tradition that produced it. Scholars have proposed various theories about why such technology disappeared, suggesting that perhaps the fall of the Roman Empire disrupted the scholarly networks and resources necessary to maintain this knowledge, or that the device was so specialized and so expensive to produce that it remained the work of a single brilliant craftsman whose techniques died with him. But the fundamental mystery remains that the ancient world produced something that modernity only rediscovered and understood through 21st century imaging technology, implying that the gap between what we know about ancient capabilities and what ancient peoples actually achieved may be far greater than we typically imagine. This humbling realization invites us to reconsider other ancient artifacts that we may have dismissed as merely decorative or ceremonial, wondering whether hidden within museum collections worldwide lie other mechanisms whose true sophistication has eluded us, waiting for future technologies to reveal their ingenious purposes. The Antikythera mechanism thus stands not merely as a remarkable artifact of mechanical ingenuity, but as a profound reminder of the limits of our understanding and the dangers of underestimating the intellectual achievements of those who came before us. In this light, the Antikythera mechanism serves as a humbling counterpoint to our modern assumption of linear technological progress, suggesting instead that human ingenuity has always existed in pockets of brilliance, sometimes flourishing magnificently before being lost to the ravages of time, conquest, and cultural disruption. Its corroded gears whisper to us across millennia that the story of human achievement is far more complex and contingent than any simple narrative of advancement could ever capture. Imagine standing before a structure built nearly 2,000 years ago, its walls still largely intact, its surfaces still largely sound, weathering the passage of centuries with a resilience that defies our modern expectations of material degradation and decay. This is the reality of Roman concrete, a substance so remarkably durable that it has outlasted the empires that created it. And one of the most perplexing mysteries in the study of ancient construction lies not merely in its longevity, but in its capacity to repair itself when cracks and fractures appear within its structure. The Romans, through either deliberate innovation or fortunate accident, developed a concrete mixture that possessed properties we are only now beginning to understand and replicate in our contemporary laboratories, a self-healing capability that seems almost impossibly sophisticated for a civilization that lacked modern chemistry and materials science. The secret, as modern researchers have gradually uncovered through microscopic analysis and experimental reconstruction, resides in the inclusion of volcanic ash, specifically a material called pozzolana, which when combined with lime and seawater creates a chemical environment unlike anything in modern Portland cement formulations. When water penetrates microcracks within this ancient concrete, it triggers a continuous hydration process involving the reaction of unreacted lime particles with carbon dioxide in the water and air, gradually producing calcium carbonate that fills the very fissures that would normally expand and propagate through the material. This process of self-healing occurs slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet persistently over decades and centuries, allowing structures like the Pantheon and the harbors at Kosa to remain functional despite their exposure to the corrosive marine environment and the relentless mechanical stresses of time. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with this phenomenon stems from a fundamental dissonance between our assumptions about ancient technological capacity and the undeniable evidence before us, creating a cognitive tension that compels us toward explanation and understanding. We have constructed a narrative that suggests ancient peoples were somehow less capable, less scientific, and less sophisticated than ourselves. Yet here stands concrete that performs functions we have only recently begun to artificially engineer into our most advanced materials through expensive additives and proprietary processes. What makes this phenomenon particularly disorienting is that the Romans themselves may not have fully understood the chemical basis of their creation, yet they deployed it with remarkable consistency and success across their vast empire, suggesting that knowledge can be transmitted and refined through practice and observation without requiring the explicit theoretical framework we associate with modern science. We have normalized this contradiction by categorizing Roman achievement as either fortunate accident or accidental discovery, thereby preserving our sense of linear progress and modern superiority, rather than acknowledging that ancient peoples possessed observational skills and engineering intuition that occasionally surpassed our own theoretical understanding, and that sometimes empirical success predates scientific explanation by centuries or millennia. The Pantheon's dome, still standing intact after nearly 19 centuries, serves as perhaps the most eloquent testimony to this principle. A structure whose concrete has survived earthquakes, fires, and the weight of its own ambition through mechanisms its builders could neither name nor fully comprehend, yet understood through the patient accumulation of experience across generations. In this sense, Roman concrete represents not a lucky accident frozen in time, but rather the product of a sophisticated empirical methodology that modern science is only now validating through the language of chemistry and materials physics, reminding us that understanding and mastery need not always arrive through the same pathway. Among the most perplexing mysteries of military history exists a substance so formidable that it fundamentally altered the balance of power in the medieval Mediterranean, a weapon so devastating that entire naval fleets were obliterated by its mere presence, and yet today we cannot definitively say what it actually was or how it was manufactured. This was Greek fire, the legendary incendiary weapon of the Byzantine Empire that burned with such ferocious intensity that it could ignite upon water itself, defying the natural laws of combustion as understood by contemporary observers and creating a sense of invulnerability that persisted for centuries. The historical record tells us that Greek fire emerged around the 7th century CE, developed during the reign of Emperor Constantine IV, attributed to a Syrian engineer named Callinicus who brought his knowledge to Constantinople precisely when the young Byzantine Empire faced existential threats from Arab naval forces that had begun systematically destroying Christian shipping and besieging major cities along the coast. The weapon appeared almost supernaturally devastating in contemporary accounts, with historians and witnesses describing how it would engulf enemy ships in torrents of flame that could not be extinguished by conventional means, how it would burn even when submerged in seawater, how soldiers who came into contact with it would suffer wounds that seemed impossible to treat, and how the very rumor of its deployment would cause enemy fleets to abandon their positions in panic. The practical application of Greek fire involved a complex apparatus, a bronze tube or siphon mounted upon the bow or sides of Byzantine warships, through which the substance could be sprayed toward enemy vessels in a controlled stream, creating a visual and psychological weapon that combined genuine destructive capability with an almost supernatural aura of invincibility, because the enemy could neither comprehend how it functioned nor devise an adequate defense against its use. What remains genuinely remarkable is that despite centuries of historical documentation, despite countless Byzantine sources describing its deployment in battle, despite the significant military advantage it provided to the empire for approximately 500 years. The actual chemical composition of Greek fire has been entirely lost to history, vanishing alongside the sophisticated knowledge systems and manufacturing processes that produced it. Historians and chemists have spent generations proposing theories about what Greek fire might have contained, suggesting combinations of quicklime, which ignites upon contact with water, or petrochemical compounds like naphtha or petroleum products that could burn upon any surface, or perhaps organic substances that generate sufficient heat to spontaneously ignite, or elaborate mixtures of multiple compounds designed specifically to resist conventional extinguishing methods and produce flames of extraordinary intensity and duration. The profound psychological impact of Greek fire lay in its fundamental challenge to the observable rules of nature. Because soldiers trained in conventional warfare had no category for understanding a weapon that burned upon water, that could not be extinguished by the traditional means of quenching flames, that seemed to violate the basic principles of how fire actually behaves in the physical world. Creating a sense of facing an enemy with access to nearly supernatural technology and creating a genuine psychological barrier against resistance or counterattack. This weapon persists in the collective memory of military history despite its complete loss from the archaeological and documentary record, because it represents the perfect convergence of genuine military effectiveness, documented historical impact, and utter incomprehensibility in terms of its actual mechanism, making it function as a kind of perfect mystery that we have normalized as a genuine part of history, while simultaneously acknowledging that its true nature remains beyond our comprehensive understanding or verification. Beneath the dusty floors of Baghdad, archaeologists in the 1930s uncovered a series of peculiar clay jars dating back nearly 2,000 years to the Parthian Empire, objects that would spark one of history's most enduring mysteries about ancient technological capability. These vessels, standing roughly 5 inches tall and crafted from terracotta clay, contained copper cylinders suspended within the jars by asphalt plugs, and inside those copper tubes rested iron rods that appeared to serve no obvious decorative or practical purpose within the context of known Parthian civilization. When researchers examined these artifacts more closely, they noticed the distinctive corrosion patterns on the metals, the asymmetrical arrangement of materials, and the way these objects were grouped together in clusters, which led to an almost inescapable hypothesis. These ancient people may have deliberately created electrochemical cells capable of generating electrical current. This realization triggered a cascade of speculation that continues even today, with enthusiasts and researchers alike wondering whether ancient Mesopotamians possessed knowledge of electrochemistry far more advanced than conventional historical narratives suggest. The logical mechanism driving this persistent fascination is rooted in a fundamental human desire to discover evidence of hidden sophistication in ancient peoples, a psychological impulse that becomes particularly powerful when we encounter artifacts that seem to defy easy explanation within established frameworks of technological development. When scientists actually replicated these Baghdad batteries in laboratories using period-appropriate materials and techniques, they discovered that these devices could indeed generate modest electrical currents, measurable and real, which seemed to validate the hypothesis and provide concrete evidence for a capability that should not have existed in the ancient world according to everything we thought we knew. This discovery created a compelling paradox. The jars demonstrably worked as electrical generators, yet no historical records from Parthian, Greek, or Egyptian sources mention such technology. No other archaeological evidence supports widespread electrical knowledge, and no artifacts emerged showing practical applications of this supposed electrical capability in ancient times. The mechanism perpetuating belief in the Baghdad Battery's historical significance, despite these logical inconsistencies, operates through our tendency to find meaningful patterns in ambiguous evidence, to allow the simple fact of replicability to overshadow the absence of supporting context, and to unconsciously favor narratives that challenge established timelines because they feel more interesting and provocative. We have essentially normalized this contradiction by permitting the Baghdad Battery to occupy a permanent space in popular discussions of ancient mysteries, treating it simultaneously as a genuine technological achievement and as an unsolved enigma without requiring resolution of the fundamental tension between those two positions. The objects remain genuinely intriguing artifacts worthy of study, yet they have transcended their actual historical status to become emblems of lost knowledge and forgotten capability, icons that represent our hunger to believe ancient civilizations possess secrets we have yet to recover, a hunger so powerful that it persists regardless of the lack of evidence connecting these mysterious jars to any actual practical application in the ancient world. The Baghdad Battery has thus become a mirror reflecting our own anxieties about technological progress and historical knowledge. We cannot resist imagining that ancient peoples understood electricity, because doing so lets us imagine that wisdom, once possessed, might be recovered again, or that the arc of human capability is not as linear as we assume. Nestled within the British Museum in London resides one of the most perplexing artifacts of the Roman world, a chalice of profound mystery known as the Lycurgus Cup, created sometime during the 4th century CE and fashioned from a single piece of dichroic glass that exhibits properties so extraordinary that modern scientists struggled for decades to explain its fundamental composition and origin. When light passes through this ancient vessel from the outside, it appears a deep jade green, almost opaque and unremarkable, yet when illuminated from within or when held up to a bright light source, the cup transforms entirely into a luminous ruby red, a phenomenon so striking and deliberate that it could not possibly be accidental, and this chromatic shift points toward an understanding of nanotechnology that predates our modern scientific era by over 1,500 years. The Romans who crafted this cup possessed knowledge of how to suspend microscopic particles of gold and silver within molten glass, particles so infinitesimally small that they interact with light waves in ways that create this dramatic optical illusion, a technique requiring not only advanced chemical knowledge, but also extraordinary precision and control during the manufacturing process that we associate exclusively with contemporary laboratories and industrial facilities. The mechanism behind this transformation operates through something called the plasmon resonance effect, wherein metal nanoparticles suspended within a glass matrix absorb and reflect specific wavelengths of light depending on the angle and intensity of illumination, creating colors that seem impossible within the constraints of ordinary material science. And yet here exists tangible proof that ancient artisans understood these principles well enough to deliberately engineer them into their work. What makes the Lycurgus Cup particularly unsettling to our modern understanding of technological progress is that we have no manufacturing records, no instructional texts, no theoretical frameworks from the Roman period that explain how such knowledge was acquired or transmitted. And so we find ourselves in the peculiar position of possessing the artifact itself while remaining largely ignorant of the methodology that produced it. The persistence of this mystery mirrors a broader human tendency to compartmentalize discoveries that challenge our assumptions about linear technological progress. For we have normalized the idea that ancient peoples could not have possessed such sophisticated understanding without written documentation to prove it. Yet the cup itself stands as silent testimony to capabilities that our own theories cannot adequately explain. We continue to study it, to photograph it, to measure the precise composition of those nanoparticles with our electron microscopes and spectrographic equipment. And in doing so, we gradually reconstruct the knowledge that once existed but somehow vanished from human memory, leaving only this mysterious vessel as a reminder that our ancestors possessed depths of technical sophistication that we are only now beginning to recover and comprehend. Perhaps the most humbling lesson the Lycurgus Cup offers is that technological sophistication may not follow the linear trajectory we assume, and that knowledge itself can be both remarkably durable, preserved in physical form across millennia, and profoundly fragile, lost to us the moment its practitioners cease to document or transmit it to successive generations. The Lycurgus Cup thus becomes not merely an archaeological curiosity, but a cautionary tale about the fragility of specialized knowledge systems, reminding us that civilizations can achieve remarkable technical heights in isolated domains while simultaneously remaining vulnerable to the catastrophic loss of expertise when institutional structures collapse or priorities shift away from their preservation. Deep within the historical records of medieval weaponry lies one of the most persistent and captivating mysteries of ancient metallurgy, the legendary Damascus Steel, a material so renowned for its exceptional quality and distinctive appearance that warriors across continents sought blades forged from this miraculous substance. Yet the actual method of its creation remains shrouded in uncertainty and debate even to this present day. The Damascus steel that emerged from forges in the Middle East, particularly in the city of Damascus during the medieval period, possessed remarkable properties that distinguished it dramatically from ordinary steel of the time, demonstrating a combination of hardness and flexibility that seemed almost supernatural to observers who had never encountered such balanced qualities in a single blade. The surface of authentic Damascus steel exhibited characteristic wavy patterns and swirls that resembled flowing water or wood grain, patterns so distinctive and beautiful that merely gazing upon a Damascus blade seemed to transport one into a realm where metallurgical science and artistry merged seamlessly into something transcendent. The weapon would hold a razor-sharp edge even after extended combat, yet it would not shatter or break under the tremendous stresses of battle, a duality of properties that made it virtually impossible to defeat an opponent wielding such a blade when confronted with inferior steel. Historical accounts describe Damascus steel weapons with an almost reverential tone, suggesting that soldiers possessing such blades held a significant psychological advantage before combat even commenced, knowing that their weapons would outperform those of their enemies in nearly every measurable way. Modern metallurgists investigating these legendary blades through careful scientific analysis have discovered that authentic Damascus steel was likely created through a complex process involving the smelting and working of specific iron ores that naturally contained elevated levels of vanadium and other trace elements, elements that would create the distinctive crystalline structures responsible for both the beautiful surface patterns and the superior mechanical properties. The Woot steel, as it was known in ancient Sanskrit sources, arrived in Damascus through trade routes from India, where master smiths had developed techniques for creating these exceptional materials through careful temperature management and repeated heating and folding processes that would align the metal's internal structure in optimal ways. Yet despite possessing clear scientific explanations rooted in chemistry and metallurgical physics, the legend of Damascus steel persists in popular consciousness as a material of almost magical properties, a persistence that suggests our human minds remain more comfortable with mystery and mythology than with acknowledging the patient, methodical work of ancient craftspeople who achieved remarkable results through systematic observation and experimentation. We continue to speak of Damascus steel as though it possessed inherent supernatural qualities, even as modern scientists can replicate its properties in laboratories using entirely conventional methods, demonstrating that the true magic lay not in any mystical properties, but rather in the profound knowledge and skill of the artisans who understood their materials at a level that seemed incomprehensible to their contemporaries and remains impressive even by contemporary standards. This humble reality, that patience, observation, and craftsmanship could achieve what seemed impossible, stands as a timeless reminder that the greatest achievements of human civilization often emerge not from supernatural intervention, but from the quiet dedication of skilled minds working within the constraints of their materials and era, finding elegant solutions to complex problems through iterative refinement and an almost meditative commitment to their craft. In the heart of New Delhi, standing within the ruins of Qut Complex, there rises a remarkable column of iron that has puzzled metallurgists and historians for over 1,500 years, a structure so anomalous in its composition and preservation that it seems to defy the very laws of chemistry and corrosion that govern the degradation of metal in our world. This pillar, approximately 23 feet in height and weighing nearly 6 tons, was erected sometime in the 4th or 5th century during the reign of the Gupta Empire. Yet when subjected to rigorous scientific analysis in the 1970s, researchers discovered something that should not exist according to modern understanding of iron oxidation and rust formation. The pillar contains virtually no phosphorus in its iron composition, which is extraordinarily unusual because virtually all iron smelting processes, whether ancient or modern, incorporate phosphorus as a natural byproduct of the heating and reduction of ore, and this absence of phosphorus, combined with the presence of a thin protective layer of crystalline iron oxide that somehow prevents deeper corrosion, creates a surface that has remained largely immune to the relentless decay that should have consumed such an object centuries ago. When modern metallurgists examined samples from the pillar, they found themselves unable to fully explain the mechanism by which this iron has survived, proposing various theories involving the specific climate of Delhi, the particular composition of the original ore, or even advanced smelting techniques that were somehow lost to history. Yet none of these explanations completely satisfies the peculiar reality of what stands before us. The psychological mechanism by which we rationalize this impossibility involves what we might call a kind of intellectual compartmentalization, whereby we acknowledge that something contradicts our understanding of chemistry and materials science, yet we simultaneously convince ourselves that there must be some logical explanation that simply hasn't been discovered yet, that the ancient world must have possessed some knowledge or technique that has escaped our modern documentation. We assume that because the pillar exists and can be examined, because it is made of iron and follows the basic laws of physics, there must be some hidden variable or overlooked factor that explains its preservation, and this assumption feels more comfortable than genuinely confronting the gap between what we expect and what we observe. Historians and scientists have largely normalized this incongruity by filing it away in the category of ancient mysteries, treating it as an interesting historical curiosity rather than a fundamental challenge to our understanding of ancient metallurgical capability. And in doing so, we have created a comfortable distance between ourselves and the profound implications of what this pillar might suggest about knowledge that existed in the ancient world. Despite having no entirely satisfactory logical explanation, despite the scientific literature remaining incomplete in its account of how this iron has endured, the Iron Pillar of Delhi continues to stand in the ruins of Quit, corroding at a pace so slow that it might take thousands of additional years to consume what remained after 15 centuries of exposure to monsoons and humidity and the elements. We pass by it with photographs and measurements and scientific papers, yet we have normalized the gap between our theories and the reality of its persistence, accepting it as simply another mysterious artifact from an age whose technical accomplishments continue to surprise us. And in this acceptance, we rest comfortably without demanding the kind of revolutionary understanding that such an object might actually require. Yet perhaps this comfort itself is the true mystery, not how the ancients forged this pillar, but how we have trained ourselves to observe the inexplicable without permitting it to fundamentally alter our sense of what the past was capable of achieving. In the year 212 before the Common Era, the city of Syracuse found itself under siege by Roman naval forces, and according to historical accounts that have persisted for nearly 2,000 years, the brilliant mathematician and engineer Archimedes constructed a weapon of remarkable ingenuity that would harness the power of sunlight itself to ignite the wooden hulls of enemy ships from a considerable distance away. The mechanism, as described in ancient texts, involved the strategic arrangement of mirrors or polished bronze shields that would concentrate the sun's rays into an intensely focused beam of heat, capable of reaching temperatures sufficient to set timber ablaze, thereby creating what modern observers have come to call the Death Ray, a weapon that existed at the intersection of optical science and military necessity. The historical narrative suggests that Roman commanders became so fearful of this device that they ordered their fleet to maintain a safe distance from the city's walls, preventing the siege from advancing effectively and allowing Syracuse to resist the Roman onslaught for an extended period through the application of pure mathematical principles rather than conventional warfare. However, when modern physicists and optical engineers have attempted to replicate this feat using the tools and methodologies available to Archimedes in his era, the results have been decidedly underwhelming and inconsistent, as the practical challenges of directing sunlight with sufficient precision and intensity to ignite distant objects proved far more formidable than the ancient accounts would suggest. Despite this fundamental disconnect between the historical narrative and reproducible experimental results, the story of Archimedes' Death Ray has maintained a powerful grip on human imagination and popular culture for centuries, appearing regularly in historical documentaries, popular science discussions, and educational materials, as if the extraordinary claims had been thoroughly verified by rigorous examination. The psychological appeal of this myth seems to rest upon our deep human fascination with the notion that ancient peoples possessed knowledge or capabilities that modern science has somehow lost or forgotten, a narrative that satisfies a particular hunger for mystery and hidden wisdom in our historical past, allowing us to imagine that we have somehow regressed from a golden age of understanding rather than advancing progressively forward. We continue to present this unproven weapon as historical fact in countless contexts, rarely acknowledging the gap between legend and evidence, as though the mere antiquity of a claim somehow grants it legitimacy even in the face of practical impossibility, revealing how thoroughly we remain willing to suspend critical examination when a story resonates with our preferred vision of history. This willingness to embrace historical mythology over experimental evidence becomes particularly pronounced when a narrative offers us technological wonder divorced from moral complexity, allowing us to celebrate human ingenuity without confronting the destructive purposes toward which such ingenuity is inevitably directed. In this way, the Death Ray exemplifies how our relationship with history is fundamentally shaped not by what actually occurred, but by what we need to believe about ourselves and our ancestors. We construct elaborate rationalizations for why ancient texts must be trusted over modern experimentation, accepting without scrutiny that Archimedes achieved what contemporary optical engineers cannot, because the alternative, that our ancestors were subject to the same human tendencies toward exaggeration and mythmaking that plague us today, forces us to confront an uncomfortable equality across the centuries and surrender our romantic notion that genius once operated under fundamentally different rules. In the 1st century of the Common Era, in the bustling city of Alexandria, Egypt, a Greek mathematician and engineer named Heron created one of the most remarkable mechanical devices of the ancient world, yet it remained almost entirely forgotten for nearly 2,000 years, existing in the margins of history as little more than a curious footnote in dusty manuscripts. Heron's invention was called the eolipal, a spherical bronze vessel suspended between two supports, with a fire burning beneath it to heat water inside the chamber, and as the water turned to steam, that pressurized vapor traveled through thin bronze tubes that curved back upon themselves in opposing directions, causing the entire sphere to spin rapidly and violently, creating the first known steam-powered engine in human history. The device was ingenious in its engineering, elegant in its mechanics, and completely useless in any practical sense, for Heron designed it primarily as a novelty to amuse the priests of temples, who would use the spinning sphere to automatically open heavy temple doors when they lit the sacred fire beneath it, a parlor trick masquerading as divine intervention. What is truly bizarre about Heron's steam engine is not merely that such advanced technology existed in ancient times, but rather that this working prototype of a technology that would not be seriously developed for another 17 centuries was regarded as nothing more than an amusing theatrical device, a magical illusion for religious ceremonies rather than a practical tool worthy of serious industrial development. The psychological mechanism behind this curious oversight relates to how civilizations view innovations within the context of their immediate economic and social needs. The ancient world had no shortage of cheap labor in the form of slaves and subjugated peoples, which meant there was simply no pressing economic incentive to develop mechanical alternatives to human power. And furthermore, the intellectual framework of ancient engineering was primarily concerned with static structures like aqueducts, bridges, and buildings rather than dynamic machines that could be harnessed for production. Even more intriguingly, the concept of progress itself was not embedded in ancient philosophical thought the way it became embedded in the post-Renaissance worldview. Technological advancement for its own sake, the notion that innovation should be pursued relentlessly to transform society, was simply not a driving cultural value in Heron's time, and so a device that could theoretically revolutionize manufacturing and transportation was instead relegated to the realm of amusement and spectacle. What persists in this story is a profound disconnect between technological capability and technological application, a reminder that merely inventing something does not guarantee that it will be developed or understood as revolutionary, and that the adoption of technology is not determined by its ingenuity alone, but by the economic structures, labor availability, and cultural values of the society in which it appears. Heron's eolipal eventually faded entirely from Western knowledge during the Middle Ages and was only rediscovered in the modern era when European scholars retrieved his manuscripts from Arab libraries, where his work had been carefully preserved and studied for centuries. Yet even then it took the Industrial Revolution and the urgent demands of manufacturing capitalism to finally transform the theoretical steam engine into the practical powerhouse that would define the modern world. Suggesting that Heron was simply born 1,700 years too early in the wrong economic system, with the wrong cultural assumptions about what technology should accomplish. Scattered throughout the archaeological sites of the Roman Empire, from Britain to the Rhine Valley, archaeologists have discovered small bronze objects of remarkable geometric precision, each one a perfect dodecahedron, a 12-sided polyhedron with pentagonal faces, typically ranging in size from 1 to 3 inches in diameter, and yet despite nearly 2 centuries of serious academic investigation. The true purpose of these artifacts remains one of archaeology's most persistent and genuinely baffling mysteries. These objects, now known as Roman dodecahedrons, were manufactured in significant numbers during the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, with examples concentrated particularly in the northwestern frontier regions of the Roman provinces. Yet no Roman text, no inscription, no surviving documentation of any kind makes a single mention of their function or significance, leaving modern scholars to construct increasingly elaborate theories about what these perfectly crafted bronze vessels might have been used for, theories that range from the plausible to the absurd, from astronomical calculators to candle holders to mystical healing devices. The objects themselves present a paradox of intentional precision and apparent purposelessness, for they were manufactured with considerable skill and expense, suggesting that Romans valued them enough to mass-produce them across multiple provinces, and yet this value apparently did not warrant a single written explanation of their utility, which stands in stark contrast to the Roman tendency to document, describe, and record nearly everything else from their civilization in meticulous detail. What appears to have happened, according to the current understanding of how human knowledge persists and gets lost, is that Roman dodecahedrons occupied a cultural space where their function was so obvious to the people of that time, so embedded in the daily practice of a specific trade or religious ritual or military application, that it required no explanation, much like how a modern person would not need to document the purpose of a coffee mug or a light switch. And when the Roman Empire collapsed, and the civilization that understood these objects was disrupted and scattered, the contextual knowledge that gave them meaning simply evaporated into the historical record, leaving behind only the physical objects themselves, beautiful and precise and utterly enigmatic. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what we might call contextual loss, the way that knowledge embedded in practice rather than in writing becomes invisible once the practice itself disappears. And this phenomenon has persisted because the objects themselves survived when the explanatory framework did not, creating a tantalizing archaeological mystery that has induced scholars to propose everything from dice for games to surgical instruments to mathematical teaching aids, each theory carrying a certain plausibility while ultimately remaining speculative and ultimately untestable. This mystery has become normalized in academic and popular culture not as a failure of historical understanding, but rather as a fascinating example of how much we can know about a civilization through its artifacts while remaining fundamentally ignorant about some of its most common objects. And this normalization reflects a deeper acceptance that the past is inherently mysterious and that some questions will never receive definitive answers. Even when the physical evidence lies directly before us, inviting contemplation and wonder about all the small daily objects we create and use and assume are important enough to preserve, never realizing that we too may someday become a forgotten civilization whose basic technologies remain forever mysterious to those who come after. In the year 132 of the Common Era, during the Eastern Han dynasty of China, a remarkable man named Zhang created something that would not be matched in sophistication for nearly 2,000 years. An invention so advanced that Western scientists would struggle to comprehend how it could possibly have functioned without electricity or modern materials. Yet this seismograph stood in the imperial court and detected earthquakes across vast distances with an accuracy that confounded all rational explanation at the time. Zhang was a polymath of extraordinary talents, working as an astronomer, mathematician, engineer, and poet, and he became deeply troubled by the fact that the Chinese Empire, despite its vastness and sophistication, had no systematic way of knowing when earthquakes occurred in distant provinces, meaning that regions could be devastated and the capital would remain ignorant for days or even weeks, causing delayed relief efforts and a loss of life that could have been prevented with proper warning. The device itself consisted of a bronze vessel approximately 6 feet in diameter, shaped like a decorative urn, with 8 dragon heads positioned at cardinal and intercardinal points around its exterior, each dragon's mouth holding a small bronze ball, and beneath each dragon sat a bronze toad with its mouth open and ready to receive whatever the dragon above might release. Inside this seemingly impossible contraption was a complex mechanism that Zhang designed based on his understanding of pendulums and the transmission of force through carefully balanced systems. and when even the slightest tremor occurred in the earth, the sensitive internal pendulum would swing and trigger a mechanical release that would cause one of the 8 balls to fall from a dragon's mouth directly into the corresponding toad's open jaw below. The sound of a bronze ball dropping into a toad's mouth would immediately alert officials in the palace, and more importantly, the specific dragon that had released its ball would indicate the direction from which the earthquake had originated, allowing the emperor to dispatch aid and resources to the affected region with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The psychological mechanism underlying the genius of Zhang Heng's design was rooted in his understanding that natural phenomena, even something as seemingly chaotic and unpredictable as earthquakes, follow consistent physical principles that can be captured and measured through mechanical means, a revolutionary concept that suggested the universe operated according to laws rather than pure randomness or divine whim. What makes this invention even more extraordinary is that historical records indicate it actually worked, that officials in the capital received notifications of distant earthquakes, sent out verification missions, and confirmed that tremors had indeed occurred in the regions indicated by the seismograph, meaning Zhang Heng had solved a problem that would not be scientifically addressed again until the 19th century, when modern seismographs were independently developed in Europe and Japan. Centuries after his death, yet despite this documented success and the clear logical principles behind its operation, the exact internal mechanism of Zhang Heng's seismograph was never fully recorded, and the original device was lost during the fall of the Han Dynasty, leaving subsequent generations with only descriptions and speculation about how something so apparently impossible could have actually functioned in reality. Modern archaeologists and engineers have attempted numerous reconstructions based on historical descriptions, and while some designs have achieved modest success in detecting vibrations, none have fully replicated the sensitivity and reliability that ancient texts attributed to Zhang Heng's original creation, suggesting that some aspect of his mechanical genius remains locked away in history. A tantalizing reminder that innovation and understanding can flourish in any era when curiosity meets necessity. Deep within the sagas and historical accounts of Viking seafaring, there exists a peculiar reference to stones called solarstein, or sunstones, devices that Norse navigators allegedly used to locate the sun, even when it remained hidden behind thick cloud cover or fog during their long ocean voyages across the North Atlantic. According to historical texts and archaeological interpretations, these mysterious stones possess the remarkable ability to polarize light in such a way that a skilled navigator could determine the sun's position, and therefore maintain a correct heading toward distant shores, even when visibility conditions made direct observation completely impossible. The concept emerged from scattered mentions in medieval Icelandic sagas, where seafarers referenced these tools as essential instruments for their navigation systems. Yet the actual stones themselves have never been definitively discovered or conclusively identified among Viking archaeological collections, lending the entire notion an ethereal quality that blurs the boundary between documented historical practice and maritime legend. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is that modern scientific investigation has revealed that certain naturally occurring minerals, specifically calcite crystals found throughout northern Europe and Scandinavia, do indeed exhibit optical properties called birefringence that allow them to polarize sunlight in predictable ways. Meaning that the Vikings may have actually discovered and utilized an ingenious optical technology centuries before the principles of light polarization were formally understood through modern physics. The mechanism works through the interaction of light waves with the crystalline structure of the mineral, which splits unpolarized sunlight into 2 distinct waves traveling at different velocities, creating a visible pattern that shifts and changes depending on the angle between the observer and the sun's actual position, allowing a trained navigator to triangulate direction with surprising accuracy even through fog, clouds, or the dimness of overcast Arctic days. The persistence of sunstone references throughout Viking lore suggests that this was not merely fanciful storytelling, but rather encoded knowledge passed down through generations of seafarers who understood practical applications of natural materials long before science could explain why these applications worked so effectively. Yet despite compelling theoretical evidence and the plausibility of the mechanism itself, we have never found incontrovertible physical proof of actual sunstones recovered from archaeological Viking sites, No stone, with clear wear patterns indicating use as a navigational instrument, no detailed technical descriptions of how to operate one. Leaving us in the peculiar position of accepting that Vikings likely invented and mastered an optical navigation technology based entirely on inference and logical reconstruction rather than direct evidence. This remarkable gap between logical certainty and historical proof persists today, with modern scholars continuing to debate whether sunstones represent a genuine lost technology that Vikings truly possessed and used across their trade routes and explorations, or whether they are instead romantic interpretations of what Vikings might have accomplished. A distinction that becomes increasingly blurred the more carefully we examine both the historical references and the scientific properties of birefringent minerals. The sunstone phenomenon endures in popular understanding as a symbol of Viking ingenuity and sophistication, a testament to their ability to thrive in harsh maritime conditions and navigate treacherous waters through intimate knowledge of nature's tools. Yet we continue to teach and discuss these stones while acknowledging that we may never hold a genuine Viking sunstone in our hands. Accepting this perpetual uncertainty as simply another mystery woven into the fabric of a civilization that left us far more questions than answers. High in the arid plateau of southern Peru, stretching across nearly 200 square miles of seemingly empty desert, exists a collection of geometric patterns and animal figures etched into the earth with such precision and scale that they remain virtually invisible to anyone standing at ground level, a characteristic that has fascinated and perplexed archaeologists, engineers, and casual observers for nearly a century. Ever since the lines were first widely documented when commercial airline routes began crossing over the region in the 1920s. The lines themselves were created by the Nazca culture sometime between roughly 1500 BCE and 500 CE, carved by removing the darker, oxidized pebbles that cover the desert floor to reveal the lighter-colored earth beneath, a process that required enormous amounts of human labor, organizational coordination, and sustained effort across generations. Yet produced artwork that could only be truly appreciated from perspectives that would have been utterly impossible for the ancient Nazca people to experience. There are several hundred individual designs scattered across the plain, including depictions of a hummingbird measuring nearly 300 feet in length, a spider approximately 150 feet across, a monkey with an impossibly long tail, various geometric shapes including perfect trapezoids and triangles, and numerous other figures whose purposes remain subjects of intense scholarly debate and popular speculation. The psychological mechanism that drives our fascination with the Nazca Lines operates on several simultaneous levels, beginning with the fundamental human need to find meaning and intentionality in large-scale structures, which naturally leads us to imagine grand purposes and sophisticated knowledge systems that might explain why an ancient civilization would expend such enormous resources on artwork invisible from the ground. The mystery deepens because no definitive archaeological evidence has emerged to explain the primary function of these lines, whether they served astronomical purposes, ceremonial pathways, irrigation markers, territorial indicators, or purely spiritual expressions intended to be observed by deities or celestial entities. And this absence of clear explanation creates a vacuum that human minds naturally rush to fill with increasingly elaborate theories. When conventional explanations seem insufficient, we are drawn toward more extraordinary possibilities, which is precisely why alternative theories involving extraterrestrial visitors have persisted so durably in popular culture despite having no archaeological support whatsoever. Because the possibility of ancient alien involvement somehow feels more satisfying and comprehensible than accepting that ancient peoples undertook massive projects whose purposes we simply cannot fully recover or understand from the archaeological record. The Nazca Lines persist in our collective consciousness not because new evidence continually emerges supporting any particular interpretation, but because the sheer scale and mystery of the achievement taps into something deeper in how humans process information about ancient accomplishments. We seem simultaneously uncomfortable with both the idea that ancients possessed knowledge we cannot reconstruct and equally uncomfortable accepting that some human undertakings might have had purposes that required no special knowledge whatsoever, just determination and cultural meaning systems entirely foreign to our own. The lines have become normalized in our understanding as exactly the sort of thing that defines the phrase bizarre truths about ancient technology, even though the technology involved was remarkably simple, just human labor, basic tools, and geometric understanding. Yet because the lines cannot be properly appreciated through the only sensory experience available to their creators, we have collectively decided they must represent something more mysterious, more profound, and more technologically advanced than what the historical record actually suggests. In the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, near the Syrian border, lies one of the most perplexing archaeological sites ever discovered, a place called Göbekli Tepe, which means potbelly hill in Turkish, and it represents perhaps the single greatest challenge to our understanding of how human civilization developed and progressed through the ancient world. What makes this site so deeply unsettling to conventional archaeological thinking is that it dates back approximately 11,500 years, placing it firmly in what we call the pre-pottery Neolithic period, thousands of years before the development of agriculture, before the establishment of permanent settlements, before pottery was invented, and yet the structures found here display a level of architectural sophistication, artistic refinement, and organizational complexity that simply should not exist according to the traditional narrative of human development that we have accepted for more than a century. The site contains massive T-shaped stone pillars, some reaching heights of over 6 meters, some weighing as much as 15 tons, arranged in multiple circular enclosures, with intricate carvings depicting foxes, snakes, lions, and scorpions, suggesting that whoever built this possessed not only the technological capacity to quarry, shape, and position enormous blocks of stone, but also a sophisticated understanding of art, symbolism, and presumably spiritual or religious meaning that would normally require a more advanced civilization to produce. What psychologically disturbs our established framework of human progress is that Göbekli Tepe appears to represent organized, large-scale communal effort, something that we have long assumed could only emerge after hunter-gatherer societies transitioned to agriculture and developed the surplus that would allow for specialized labor and monumental construction. Yet here we find evidence suggesting that humans in the pre-pottery Neolithic may have been capable of organizing collective projects on scales we never imagined. With no apparent agricultural support system, no visible permanent settlement, no pottery for storage and trade, fundamentally challenging our deeply ingrained assumption that technological and artistic achievement must follow a linear, predictable progression from simple to complex, from basic survival to grand ambition. The mechanism of why this contradiction persists despite being so obvious is rooted in what we might call institutional inertia in academic archaeology, where the prevailing model has guided research questions, funding allocations, and interpretive frameworks for so long that encountering evidence contradicting the model creates cognitive dissonance rather than immediate acceptance and theoretical revision. And so we continue to hear various explanations and reinterpretations of Göbekli Tepe that attempt to fit it into existing paradigms rather than allowing it to reshape our understanding. We continue to assume there must be something we are not yet understanding about the site, rather than admitting that our fundamental model of human development may have significant gaps or errors. And we have normalized this process of reinterpretation so thoroughly that it seems almost reasonable to maintain our traditional narrative despite mounting evidence that the narrative itself may be incomplete or even substantially wrong in its core assumptions about how human intelligence, ambition, and organizational capacity developed through time. What we are witnessing at Göbekli Tepe is not merely an archaeological anomaly to be explained away, but a mirror held up to the limitations of our own interpretive frameworks, forcing us to confront the possibility that human capability and ambition may have manifested in ways utterly foreign to our modern expectations, and that the story of civilization's rise may be far more complex, more mysterious, and ultimately more humbling than the orderly progression we have constructed to make sense of our past. Nestled within the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, there exists a small wooden artifact discovered in 1898 during excavations at the Saqqara necropolis, a limestone carving that measures merely 7 3/4 inches in length and has become known as the Saqqara Bird, a 3,000-year-old object that has captivated the imaginations of researchers, engineers, and enthusiasts for well over a century, with claims that it represents an aerodynamic device, or perhaps even evidence of ancient aviation knowledge that predates the Wright brothers by millennia. The artifact itself appears to be a relatively straightforward representation of a bird carved from sycamore wood, complete with what appears to be a beak, wings, and a tail, yet something about its proportions, its weight distribution, and its carefully sculpted form has convinced numerous individuals that this was not merely a decorative or religious object, but rather a scale model or experimental prototype of some kind of flying apparatus that the ancient Egyptians had somehow conceived and understood. The theory emerged most prominently in the 1960s and 70s when various engineers and researchers, including those from aeronautical backgrounds, began examining the object more closely and proposed that its unusually broad, flat wings and streamlined fuselage-like body suggested aerodynamic principles that the carvers must have understood at some fundamental level, leading to claims that replicas constructed according to the bird's proportions could actually demonstrate gliding properties and might even achieve brief moments of sustained flight. What drives this persistent interpretation, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, appears to be a combination of deeply rooted human desires to attribute extraordinary technological achievement to ancient civilizations, a psychological phenomenon often linked to what researchers call the mystery bias, wherein our brains are naturally attracted to enigmatic or ambiguous information and tend to construct elaborate explanations for phenomena that could be far simpler than initially imagined. The Saqqara bird has become normalized within certain circles as a genuine artifact of ancient aeronautical engineering, with documentaries, alternative history programs, and internet communities treating it with the same reverence they might reserve for genuine lost technologies, despite the fact that Egyptologists and archaeologists maintain that the object was almost certainly a wooden votive offering, a religious object left in tombs, or perhaps a decorative element with no aeronautical significance whatsoever, and that numerous similar bird carvings discovered throughout Egypt show no particular engineering refinement or aerodynamic consideration. This normalization of an unsubstantiated claim persists because the narrative of ancient advanced technology appeals to something fundamental within human consciousness, a yearning to believe that our ancestors possessed knowledge lost to time, that gaps in historical records might conceal remarkable achievements, and that perhaps we underestimate the capabilities of civilizations separated from us by thousands of years. Even when the most straightforward explanation is simply that ancient craftspeople were skilled artists who carved birds, because birds were meaningful religious and cultural symbols in their society. Yet this inclination to project advanced knowledge onto ambiguous artifacts reveals more about our modern anxieties regarding technological progress and our fear that contemporary civilization might not be as exceptional as we believe, causing us to search through the archaeological record for reassurance that intellectual achievement has always been humanity's defining characteristic, regardless of the era. Among the most startling discoveries in the archaeological record is evidence that ancient peoples, operating without modern anesthesia, antibiotics, or any genuine understanding of neurology, performed surgical procedures directly upon the human skull and brain itself, a practice that appears in the archaeological remains of cultures separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, suggesting that trepanation, as it is called, represents one of humanity's oldest surgical interventions. The physical evidence comes to us in the form of skulls bearing perfectly circular or rectangular holes, some showing signs of healing that indicate the patient survived the operation and continued living for months or even years afterward, a fact that can only be determined through careful examination of bone remodeling patterns that show new bone growth around the surgical site. These skulls have been discovered in Peru, in France, in China, in North Africa, and in countless other locations across the globe, dating back as far as 10,000 years, with some estimates suggesting that in certain populations, up to 10% of all individuals underwent this procedure at some point during their lifetime. The tools used were made from obsidian, flint, or bone, and the surgeons employed various techniques including scraping, boring, and cutting, methods that required extraordinary skill and a steady hand despite the patient's inevitable movements and suffering. What is perhaps most remarkable is that the survival rate appears to have been reasonably high, suggesting that the ancient practitioners possessed genuine surgical knowledge that went far beyond mere superstition or random intervention. The psychological and conceptual mechanism underlying this practice likely involved a deeply held belief system that connected neurological ailments psychological disturbances, headaches, or epilepsy to spiritual imbalances or malevolent forces trapped within the skull, and that the creation of an opening would allow these harmful entities to escape and permit healing energies to enter. In many cases, the hole itself may have been considered therapeutic regardless of outcome, and the very act of performing the procedure would have reinforced the belief system that held the culture together and explained suffering in terms that felt comprehensible and manageable. What is fascinating to contemplate is how this practice persisted across such vast geographical distances and temporal spans without any possibility of cultural diffusion or communication, suggesting that human beings independently arrived at similar solutions to similar problems, driven by similar psychological needs to intervene in suffering through technological means. We have normalized ancient trepanation by removing it from the realm of superstition and placing it instead within frameworks of early medical innovation. Yet we rarely pause to consider that the fundamental impulse driving it may not have been so different from modern impulses to perform surgery when suffering occurs, and that our current medical interventions, while incomparably more sophisticated and effective, may ultimately spring from similar psychological roots. In this light, the trepan skulls become something more than mere archaeological curiosities. They are evidence of humanity's enduring struggle to transform helplessness into agency, to convert the mysterious afflictions of the body and mind into problems that can be solved through deliberate action, a transformation that may be as essential to human consciousness as the development of language itself. And perhaps this is why trepanation, despite its obvious dangers and questionable efficacy, spread so widely and persisted so stubbornly. Because the act of intervention itself, the decision to do something rather than nothing in the face of unbearable pain, may offer psychological benefits that transcend the physical outcome, a principle that modern medicine, for all its scientific rigor, has never entirely transcended. Deep within the Viking Age, between the 8th and 11th centuries, a remarkable category of weapons emerged that seemed impossibly advanced for their time, blades inscribed with the name Ulfberht that possessed metallurgical qualities far superior to their contemporaries. And these swords have puzzled archaeologists and metallurgists for generations, because the craftsmanship involved in their creation appears to have transcended the technical capabilities that medieval European blacksmiths should have possessed at that historical moment. The blades themselves were forged from a type of steel that contained very low levels of impurities, demonstrating a level of purity that wouldn't be reliably replicated in Europe until centuries later during the Industrial Revolution. And when modern scientists have examined these weapons through electron microscopy and chemical analysis, they discovered that the steel contained patterns suggesting crucible steel technology, a sophisticated method of steel production that was primarily associated with the Middle East and Central Asia rather than the Viking North. The inscription itself, which appears as plus signs flanking the name Ulfberht written in Latin characters, marked these weapons as products of exceptional quality and likely commanded extraordinary prices in the medieval marketplace, making them status symbols reserved for the wealthiest and most powerful warriors of Scandinavian society. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is the psychological mechanism at work in how these swords came to exist at all, because it suggests that Viking traders and craftsmen possessed networks of knowledge and material exchange that extended far beyond what historians long assumed, creating a hidden infrastructure of commerce and technical innovation that connected Scandinavia to distant trading centers where superior metallurgical knowledge was being actively practiced and refined. The explanation for their existence likely involves Viking traders acquiring either raw materials or finished blades through their extensive trading routes that stretched from the Baltic to Baghdad, or alternatively, Norse craftsmen may have learned advanced techniques from contacts with Middle Eastern or Byzantine metallurgists, and then applied these methods within their own workshops to create weapons that combined foreign knowledge with indigenous craftsmanship. The remarkable aspect is how these swords have become normalized within historical discourse despite their anomalous nature, with scholars accepting their existence almost casually despite the fact that they represent a technological leap that shouldn't logically have occurred given the apparent isolation of medieval European civilization. Yet we rarely discuss how profoundly unsettling it should be that the technological capabilities of a civilization can be so dramatically superior to what we assumed about them, suggesting that our understanding of medieval technical achievement has been fundamentally incomplete, and that entire channels of knowledge transfer and innovation have vanished from the historical record, leaving behind only these exceptional artifacts as ghostly echoes of a more interconnected and technologically sophisticated past than we typically acknowledge. These swords force us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that we may be systematically underestimating the technological sophistication of past civilizations, not because the evidence contradicts our assumptions, but because we have constructed historical narratives that simply lack the frameworks to accommodate such accomplishments. And in doing so, we may be obscuring countless other examples of forgotten knowledge and lost expertise that shaped the medieval world in ways we have yet to recognize or fully comprehend. The massive stone monument known as Stonehenge, located on the Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, has long been understood primarily through its visual grandeur and astronomical alignments. Yet in recent decades, researchers have begun to explore a dimension of this ancient structure that might have been equally important to its builders: its acoustic properties and the way sound behaves within and around the arrangement of stones. When researchers conducted detailed acoustic studies of Stonehenge, they discovered that the sarsen stones, those enormous blocks of sandstone that form the outer ring and trilithons, possess remarkable sound-dampening qualities that would have created a distinctly different auditory experience compared to the open landscape surrounding the monument. The stones absorb sound frequencies in ways that would have made speech clearer in certain areas while creating zones of acoustic shadow in others, and the specific spacing and height of the stones appear to have been designed, or at least have resulted in a peculiar focusing effect where sound could be projected from one area to another in patterns that seem almost intentional. This acoustic phenomenon likely would have enhanced ceremonies and rituals that took place at the site, allowing a speaker standing in particular positions to be heard with unusual clarity by crowds gathered in specific sections, while observers in other areas might have experienced the sound as more muted or even directionally confusing. The psychological impact of this acoustic design would have been profound, creating an almost supernatural sense that the stones themselves were participating in or enhancing sacred utterances, prayers, or proclamations, which would have reinforced the spiritual significance and power attributed to the structure by ancient peoples. What makes this particularly fascinating is that we cannot definitively determine whether this acoustic property was a deliberate engineering achievement by the Neolithic peoples who constructed Stonehenge between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, or whether it represents a fortunate accident of stone selection and placement that subsequent users recognized and incorporated into their ceremonial practices. Yet the acoustic dimension persists in our understanding of Stonehenge, largely unexamined by mainstream archaeology and tourism, with most visitors and scholars continuing to focus almost exclusively on the visual and astronomical aspects of the monument, as if sound were somehow a secondary concern, despite the likelihood that ancient peoples would have experienced the site as a complete sensory environment where sound played a crucial role in the power and meaning of the sacred space. Recent experimental reconstructions, where researchers have gathered in the stone circle and conducted vocal tests, have revealed that certain positions within Stonehenge create natural amplification zones where chanting or singing would resonate with an almost otherworldly quality, suggesting that acoustic engineering may indeed have been central to the monument's ritualistic purpose. This sensory dimension invites us to reconsider Stonehenge not merely as an astronomical calculator or burial ground, but as an ancient theater of sound designed to transform human voice and music into something transcendent. Such acoustic intentionality would have positioned Stonehenge as a predecessor to later amphitheaters and sacred sound spaces, where the manipulation of sound became as sophisticated and purposeful as the alignment of stones with celestial events, suggesting that ancient builders possessed an intuitive understanding of acoustical principles that modern science is only now beginning to appreciate and validate. Deep within the quarries of ancient Egypt and throughout the construction sites of the classical world, workers discovered something that defied the rigid expectations we hold about stone. Certain deposits of sandstone, particularly those found in specific geological regions around the Nile Valley and parts of the Arabian Peninsula, exhibited an unusual property that seemed to blur the line between solid rock and something far more malleable. When freshly quarried and still saturated with groundwater, these particular sandstone formations would demonstrate a flexibility that modern geologists now understand to be a temporary phenomenon related to moisture content and the specific mineral composition of the stone itself. Workers reported that they could carefully bend thin slabs of this freshly extracted material without immediate fracture, allowing them to shape and curve architectural elements in ways that would normally require extensive carving or that would be simply impossible with dry stone. The ancient builders of temples, tombs, and ceremonial structures appeared to have developed an intuitive knowledge of this window of opportunity, understanding exactly when and how to work with these materials while they retained this unusual suppleness before drying and hardening into their final rigid forms. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon rests in the fundamental physics of porous materials and the role that water plays as a lubricant between mineral particles. Sandstone is fundamentally a composite material made up of sand grains held together by various binding agents such as silica, calcite, or clay minerals. When water saturates these materials, it reduces the friction between individual grains and temporarily weakens the bonds that hold them in fixed positions relative to one another. This saturation creates a state of reduced internal stress and increased particle mobility, allowing the overall structure to deform under controlled pressure without catastrophic failure. The ancient craftspeople did not possess modern knowledge of capillary action or hydrogen bonding, yet they understood through generations of accumulated practical experience that freshly quarried stone behaved differently than stone that had been exposed to sun and air for extended periods. They learned to exploit this narrow time frame, perhaps moving newly extracted blocks immediately to their construction sites and working them while the moisture still permeated their structure. As water gradually evaporated from the stone's surface inward, the material would slowly stiffen and lock into its new shape, effectively preserving the modified geometry as the stone fully cured and hardened. Yet despite the logical simplicity of this explanation and the straightforward physics that govern this behavior, the knowledge of flexible sandstone largely disappeared from the historical record during the medieval period, and modern Western construction practices seem to have forgotten or dismissed this understanding entirely. Contemporary stonemasons rarely speak of this property, and most architectural training focuses on stone as an inherently rigid material suitable only for carving in its set state. This forgetting represents a curious human tendency to lose practical knowledge when formal scientific frameworks have not yet provided official validation and standardization. The ancient workers possessed what we might call intuitive or empirical knowledge, information gained through generations of direct physical experience rather than through documented scientific method. When classical civilization fragmented and knowledge transmission became unreliable, when the continuity of craft training was interrupted by social upheaval, this particular understanding simply evaporated from the collective memory of Western builders. It exists now primarily in the physical evidence of slightly curved architectural elements that modern historians struggle to explain, in the mysteriously flexible stone pieces that sometimes appear in archaeological contexts, in the geometric impossibilities that dot ancient structures. In the 1st century of the Common Era, a remarkable engineer and mathematician named Heron of Alexandria developed what is widely considered to be the world's first vending machine, a device so mechanically sophisticated and conceptually ahead of its time that it challenges our modern assumptions about technological progress and human ingenuity in the ancient world. This extraordinary contraption was designed to dispense holy water in Egyptian temples, and it functioned through an elegantly simple yet brilliantly executed system of weights, pulleys, levers, and counterbalances that responded to a single input, the insertion of a coin into a designated slot. When a worshipper deposited a coin, typically made of bronze or silver, the weight of that coin would fall into a pan attached to one end of a balanced lever, and this gravitational force would trigger a chain reaction of mechanical movements that would ultimately open a valve and allow a precisely measured amount of sanctified water to flow out into the supplicant's vessel below. The genius of Heron's design lay not merely in its basic function, but in the mathematical precision with which he calibrated the system, ensuring that the amount of water dispensed remained consistent regardless of minor variations in the coin's weight or the angle at which it entered the machine, demonstrating a level of engineering knowledge that required understanding principles of fluid dynamics, mechanical advantage. and material science that we typically associate only with modern technological development. This device existed approximately 2,000 years ago, crafted from bronze and stone, yet it embodied the same fundamental principles that would later govern automata, mechanical clocks, and eventually the vending machines that line our contemporary streets and transportation hubs. What makes Heron's coin machine particularly fascinating from a historical and philosophical perspective is that it was not merely a theoretical exercise or a curious novelty, but rather a functional technology that operated within the actual religious and commercial infrastructure of ancient Egypt, suggesting that societies in antiquity possessed both the technical capacity and the practical motivation to create sophisticated automated systems, contradicting the common assumption that automation and mechanical precision are definitively modern phenomena. The device remained largely forgotten for centuries, known primarily through Heron's own written descriptions preserved in classical texts, and it was not until modern scholars began to reconstruct and test his designs that we could fully appreciate the extent of his mechanical sophistication, and the startling realization that technological innovation did not proceed in a simple linear progression from ancient simplicity to modern complexity, but rather exhibited peaks of sophisticated achievement that were sometimes lost and had to be rediscovered. The psychological mechanism that allows us to maintain the narrative of constant technological progress despite evidence like Heron's machine is our tendency to rationalize away such anomalies as isolated instances of exceptional genius rather than evidence of a more capable ancient world. And we further normalize this selective interpretation by emphasizing the gaps between ancient achievements and modern ones, thereby preserving the comforting story of inevitable human advancement rather than confronting the more uncomfortable reality that knowledge and capabilities can be lost, forgotten, and must be painstakingly recovered across generations. The library at Alexandria, where Heron himself worked and taught, would later burn, taking countless mechanical treatises and engineering blueprints with it into ash, a loss so profound that we can only speculate about the countless other automated devices and sophisticated technologies that vanished forever, leaving us to wonder whether our ancestors' capabilities extended far beyond even what Heron's surviving writings reveal. Imagine traveling along a Roman road nearly 2,000 years ago, and the chariot ahead of you is equipped with a device that automatically counts the distance traveled with mechanical precision, dropping small stones into a container with each mile completed, a system so sophisticated that it seems almost impossible that such technology could have existed in an era we typically associate with horses and hand-drawn maps. This device, described in remarkable detail by the Roman engineer and author Vitruvius in his treatise on architecture, was called the hodometer, and it represents one of the most perplexing examples of ancient mechanical ingenuity that has somehow become largely forgotten in the collective memory of technological history. The mechanism operated through a series of interlocking gears and wheels that were connected to the axle of a wheeled vehicle, and as the wheels rotated during travel, they would drive increasingly complex gear systems that would eventually trigger a mechanical arm or lever that would drop a pebble or stone into a container at precise intervals corresponding to measured distances. What makes this device so conceptually bizarre is not merely that it existed, but that it emerged in a civilization that we often imagine as comparatively primitive in mechanical sophistication, yet simultaneously produced architectural marvels like the Colosseum and the Pantheon, suggesting that the Romans possessed engineering knowledge that was neither linear nor consistent across different domains of application. The psychological mechanism underlying our surprise at this discovery relates to our tendency to construct historical narratives that progress in orderly, predictable ways, where each advancement builds logically upon previous ones, and where technologies that seem advanced must necessarily appear late in the historical timeline. Yet the ancient odometer fundamentally disrupts this comfortable linear progression by demonstrating that precision engineering and mechanical automation were not phenomena exclusive to the Renaissance or Industrial Revolution. We have normalized this historical amnesia about ancient technologies by compartmentalizing our knowledge, reserving our admiration for the grand structures and philosophical achievements of ancient civilizations, while simultaneously dismissing their mechanical innovations as anomalies or exaggerations. Perhaps because acknowledging sophisticated ancient technology forces us to reconsider our assumptions about the relationship between technological advancement and cultural sophistication. The hodometer persists in obscurity despite its remarkable ingenuity, appearing in historical texts and scholarly articles, but never quite achieving the cultural resonance of more famous Roman inventions, which suggests that the strangeness of this device lies not in its mechanism, but in our collective discomfort with the idea that ancient peoples possessed knowledge and capabilities that we often assume belonged exclusively to more recent eras of human civilization. This discomfort becomes particularly acute when we consider that the hodometer was not merely a theoretical concept or a one-off curiosity, but rather a functional instrument that would have required extensive testing, refinement, and practical application across the vast Roman road network, suggesting an entire infrastructure of mechanical knowledge that has since vanished almost entirely from the historical record, leaving us to wonder what other sophisticated devices might have existed in antiquity, only to be lost when the libraries burned and the empires fell. The hodometer's disappearance raises an unsettling question about technological continuity. If such a device could vanish so thoroughly from practical use, what mechanisms of knowledge transfer failed, and how many other innovations in mechanics, mathematics, or engineering might have suffered similar fates, leaving us to reinvent solutions that ancient engineers had already perfected centuries before we believe our own civilization was ready for them. In the ancient world, before the mechanical precision of pendulums and springs became available to human craftsmen, civilizations across multiple continents developed an ingenious solution to the problem of measuring time with remarkable accuracy. And that solution involved the patient observation of water flowing from one chamber into another in carefully calibrated systems known as water clocks or clepsydras. The ancient Egyptians were among the first to perfect this technology, creating simple bowl-shaped vessels with a small hole near the bottom that allowed water to drip out at a consistent rate. And as the water level descended, markings on the interior walls would indicate how much time had passed, a concept so fundamentally sound that it remained in use for thousands of years across Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, Persia, and the Islamic world. What makes these devices truly remarkable is not merely their existence, but rather the extraordinary lengths to which ancient engineers went in order to refine them into increasingly elaborate contraptions that incorporated gears, pulleys, counterweights, and intricate mechanical escapements that would eventually influence the development of mechanical clocks centuries later. The ancient Greek mathematician and engineer Ctesibius created water clocks of such sophistication that they could measure time with an accuracy approaching that of modern mechanical timepieces, while the Alexandrian inventor Heron designed water clocks that operated automatic doors, rang bells, and even dispensed holy water in temples, demonstrating that these devices were not merely functional, but served as impressive displays of human ingenuity and mechanical understanding. The Antikythera Mechanism, that enigmatic bronze device discovered in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, likely served functions related to astronomical prediction and timekeeping, suggesting that ancient peoples possessed knowledge of mechanical principles that would not be systematically rediscovered until medieval Europe began constructing its first mechanical clocks. What fascinates us is the psychological impulse that drove these ancients to create such elaborate systems when simpler methods would have sufficed, revealing a fundamental human compulsion to not only solve practical problems, but to do so with elegance, precision, and mechanical sophistication, as though the mere function of measuring time was insufficient without the aesthetic and intellectual satisfaction of watching intricate mechanisms perform their duties with mathematical perfection. The water clock represents a bridge between purely empirical observation and mathematical engineering, a moment in human history when civilizations had developed both the theoretical understanding and the practical skill to transform natural phenomena like gravity and fluid dynamics into instruments of remarkable precision. Yet we rarely discuss these achievements in contemporary conversations about technological progress. Having instead mythologized the medieval mechanical clock as the beginning of precision timekeeping, while largely forgetting that sophisticated timekeeping had already existed for millennia in forms that were every bit as ingenious and arguably more elegant in their use of natural principles rather than mechanical complexity. The water clocks of ancient China, particularly those constructed during the Song dynasty, incorporated astronomical spheres and celestial globes that rotated in synchronization with the heavens themselves, transforming timekeeping into a form of cosmic mimicry that reflected humanity's desire to align earthly measurements with the movements of the stars. In this way, the water clock became not merely a practical instrument, but a philosophical statement, a tangible expression of humanity's place within an ordered universe governed by predictable natural laws. Beneath the marble floors of Roman bathhouses and wealthy homes lay an intricate system of hollow spaces and terracotta pipes that carried superheated air throughout entire buildings. A technological marvel that emerged around the 1st century before the Common Era and represents one of history's most sophisticated heating solutions that would not be matched again in Europe for more than 1,000 years. The hypocaust system, derived from the Greek words meaning heated from below, functioned through a deceptively simple yet ingenious principle, wherein a furnace called a prefernium would burn wood or other fuel sources, generating intense heat that workers would then channel through a network of underground chambers and vertical flues built directly into the walls of the structure, allowing warm air to rise naturally through the building and escape through openings in the roof while simultaneously warming the floors, walls, and air within the inhabited spaces above. The engineering precision required to construct these systems demanded considerable skill and planning, as builders had to calculate proper angles for airflow, design adequate space beneath floors to allow heat distribution, create terracotta box tiles that could withstand extreme temperatures without cracking, and ensure that the system would not create dangerous carbon monoxide accumulation or uncontrollable fires within the walls themselves. Yet Roman engineers accomplished this repeatedly across an empire spanning 3 continents and countless climates. What makes this technology psychologically remarkable is not merely its sophistication, but rather the conceptual leap it represents, for the Romans understood that heat could be treated as a fluid substance that moved through deliberately designed pathways, a notion that required abstract thinking about invisible forces and invisible flows of energy moving through solid matter, demonstrating that ancient peoples possessed intuitive knowledge about thermodynamics centuries before the scientific method would formalize such understanding. The hypocaust system persisted throughout the Roman period because it provided genuine comfort and served practical purposes in maintaining bathhouses at consistently warm temperatures. Yet following the collapse of Roman infrastructure in Europe, this knowledge was abandoned almost entirely, not because the technology had failed or proven inadequate, but because the centralized organization, skilled labor force, and economic stability required to build and maintain such systems simply ceased to exist, leaving medieval Europeans living in cold, unheated spaces for centuries, despite the fact that the blueprints and principles for Roman heating technology remained preserved in texts and ruins waiting to be rediscovered. The rediscovery of hypocaust principles during the Renaissance demonstrated how technological knowledge can lie dormant within a civilization, waiting for the social and economic conditions necessary to revive it, suggesting that innovation is not always a linear progression, but rather a cyclical process dependent upon factors far beyond intellectual capacity or material resources. Indeed, the hypocaust stands as a poignant reminder that civilizations do not advance in straight lines toward inevitable progress, but rather rise and fall in cycles where knowledge itself becomes a luxury that only certain societies can afford to maintain, preserve, and ultimately transmit to their successors. The Roman hypocaust thus becomes not merely a technical achievement, but a mirror reflecting the fragility of human accomplishment itself, reminding us that brilliance alone cannot guarantee a technology's survival when the social scaffolding supporting it crumbles into dust, and that the true measure of innovation lies not in its invention, but in whether succeeding generations possess both the means and the will to remember it. Deep beneath the arid plains of Persia, a network of underground tunnels stretches for thousands of kilometers, connecting distant water sources to distant cities in a manner so elegant and mathematically precise that modern engineers studying them are often left bewildered by the sophistication of their design. These are the Qanats, an irrigation technology so ancient that historians struggle to pinpoint their exact origins, though evidence suggests they emerged sometime between the 15th and 10th centuries before the Common Era, possibly developed by Persian peoples or perhaps even earlier civilizations whose names have been lost to time. The Qanat system represents one of humanity's most ingenious solutions to an ancient problem that plagued desert societies: The problem of accessing underground water reserves without the need for continuous mechanical pumping or surface-level transportation methods that would lose tremendous volumes to evaporation under the relentless sun. Basic mechanics of a qanat involve a series of carefully engineered underground channels that gently slope downward from a water source, typically an underground aquifer located in mountainous regions, carrying water through gravity alone across distances of up to 100 kilometers or more, delivering that precious resource to settlements and agricultural lands, where it emerges through a series of shafts that provide both ventilation for the tunnels and access points for maintenance and repair. What makes the qanat system particularly remarkable is that these were not crude ditches dug haphazardly into the earth, but rather required sophisticated understanding of hydrology, mathematics, and geology, with engineers needing to calculate the precise angle of descent necessary to maintain water flow without creating such steep gradients that the channels would erode or lose water pressure, a calculation they performed without the aid of modern surveying instruments or computers. Relying instead on empirical knowledge passed down through generations and on careful observation of landscape and water behavior. The construction of a single qanat demanded enormous labor investment, often taking decades to complete, requiring workers to dig thousands of vertical shafts down to depths of over 100 meters in some cases. Shafts that formed a perfect vertical line across the landscape that was maintained through astronomical observation and mathematical calculation. A feat of coordination and planning that suggests these early Persian engineers possessed knowledge that would not be rediscovered or formally documented in Western engineering texts until many centuries later. The psychological mechanism that kept this technology not only alive, but essential across Persian civilization for over 2,000 years, relates to its perfect adaptation to environmental constraints. For the qanat did not attempt to dominate or fight against the desert landscape, but rather worked in cooperation with natural forces, using gravity and the Earth's natural storage of water to solve a problem that could not be solved through any other method available to ancient peoples. The genius of the qanat system lies in its sustainability and its minimal maintenance requirements compared to surface-level irrigation channels, which meant that once the initial investment of construction was complete, the system could function with relatively little ongoing effort, a quality that made it economically sensible even for societies with limited resources and limited access to labor. And this sensibility persisted because the qanat proved itself repeatedly across centuries and across different regions where it was adopted. The evidence of artificial limbs stretches back further into human history than many people realize, with archaeological discoveries suggesting that prosthetic devices were being crafted and fitted to amputees thousands of years before modern medicine developed the sophisticated techniques we associate with limb replacement today. One of the most remarkable examples comes from Egypt, where a wooden toe discovered attached to a mummified foot dating back to around 1300 BCE demonstrates not merely the conceptual understanding that a missing body part could be replaced, but the actual mechanical implementation of this idea in a society where such innovations would have required considerable ingenuity given the available materials and tools. The ancient Egyptians, who had developed sophisticated understanding of anatomy through their practice of mummification and their medical texts, recognized that mobility and physical function could be artificially restored, and they approached this challenge with the same methodical problem-solving that characterized their architectural and engineering achievements. Beyond Egypt, evidence from Peru shows that pre-Columbian cultures were fashioning prosthetic devices from wood and other natural materials, while ancient Greek texts describe wooden hands and feet being fitted to injured soldiers and sailors, suggesting that the concept of restoring lost limbs was deeply embedded in how multiple ancient civilizations understood the relationship between the body, functionality, and survival. The psychological mechanism driving this innovation appears rooted in a fundamental human recognition that disability need not be permanent or total, that the body is to some extent malleable and improvable, and that ingenuity applied to physical problems can extend human capability beyond what nature alone provides. What makes this particularly striking is that ancient peoples possessed neither the materials science nor the understanding of medicine that we take for granted today. Yet they proceeded anyway with the conviction that attempting to restore function was worthwhile, suggesting that the impulse toward prosthetic technology emerges not from sophisticated knowledge, but from basic human desire to remain capable and engaged in the world. We continue today to normalize and invest in increasingly complex prosthetics, creating devices with motors and sensors and artificial neural connections. Yet the fundamental insight that drove ancient craftspeople to carve wooden toes has never fundamentally changed, revealing that some human impulses persist unchanged across millennia regardless of technological progress. Perhaps this persistence explains why prosthetic technology remains one of the few fields where ancient and modern innovations stand in genuine dialogue. A medieval wooden leg and a contemporary bionic limb are separated by centuries of advancement, yet both represent the same defiant refusal to accept the finality of loss. This continuity of purpose across ages suggests that the history of prosthetics is fundamentally a history of human resilience, a chronicle not of technological triumph, but of communities consistently choosing restoration over resignation, a choice that remains as consequential today as it was for the Egyptian craftsperson fitting a wooden toe to a laborer's foot. In this light, the modern amputee who chooses a prosthetic is participating in a tradition as old as civilization itself, inheriting not just a technology, but a philosophy. The understanding that human agency and creativity can transform the narrative of physical limitation into one of continued participation and purpose. And yet this philosophy, born from necessity in ancient times, has evolved into something more nuanced in our modern era. We now understand that prosthetics are not merely tools for restoration, but instruments of identity, allowing individuals to reimagine themselves beyond the limitations that injury or illness initially imposed, transforming what was once purely functional into something profoundly personal. Imagine standing in a Roman medical clinic during the 2nd century, your vision gradually clouding over the course of months until the world becomes nothing but blur and shadow, and a physician approaches you with a hollow bronze needle, steady hands, and absolute confidence that what he is about to do will restore your sight by physically displacing the clouded lens deeper into your eye where it will no longer obstruct your vision. This was the reality of Roman cataract surgery, a procedure so remarkably advanced that it would not be significantly improved upon for over 1,000 years. A startling testament to the sophistication of ancient medical knowledge that seems almost impossible when we consider how crude their understanding of anatomy and disease must have been. The Romans did not know that cataracts were caused by the crystallization of proteins in the lens, nor did they possess any understanding of how light refraction actually worked. And yet they developed a surgical technique called couching or needling that involved inserting a thin instrument through the cornea and deliberately pushing the opaque lens down and back into the vitreous humor of the eye, allowing light to pass through the now clear pupil to the retina behind it. The procedure was performed without modern anesthesia, without antibiotics, without magnification, and without any real understanding of the microscopic structures involved, relying instead on a kind of practical anatomical knowledge accumulated through countless surgeries, some successful and some catastrophically not. And the physicians who performed these operations must have been operating primarily on intuition, experience, and a willingness to accept significant rates of failure as the cost of attempting to restore vision to the blind. What makes this technology so psychologically intriguing is that it represents a case where ancient physicians achieved remarkable practical results while operating within a completely incorrect theoretical framework, suggesting that sometimes accumulated observational experience can carry you further than you should logically be able to go, and that the hands can learn what the mind cannot fully comprehend. The fact that couching cataract surgery persisted and was still being performed in various forms well into the 19th and 20th centuries, despite the eventual development of superior extraction techniques, speaks to the power of proven practical methods to maintain cultural momentum, even when better alternatives become available. And somehow we have normalized the idea that the ancients were simultaneously brilliant enough to perform delicate eye surgery and ignorant enough to believe in humors and miasmas, when perhaps the real truth is far more unsettling, that expertise and understanding are not always as connected as we assume them to be. We see this pattern repeated throughout history: surgeons who could open a skull without killing the patient, but believed the brain was merely a cooling mechanism for the blood, or physicians who successfully set compound fractures through pure mechanical intuition while operating under theories of medicine that we now recognize as fundamentally backwards, suggesting that the human capacity for practical mastery may often outpace our theoretical understanding by centuries, leaving us to wonder how many modern medical practices we consider scientifically sound might similarly rest on foundations far more fragile than we care to admit. Perhaps this is why the image of the Roman surgeon with his bronze needle remains so haunting, not because he was primitive, but because he represents a kind of competence that exists in a space beyond explanation, a mastery that demanded respect precisely because no one, not even he himself, could fully articulate why it worked. Beneath the earth near the city of Xi'an in China lies one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the modern era, a vast underground army of terracotta soldiers that was created over 2,000 years ago during the reign of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, and this monumental undertaking involved thousands of artisans working for decades to construct an estimated 8,000 life-sized warrior figurines. Each one individually crafted with remarkable detail and placed in precise military formation within underground chambers, designed to serve the emperor in the afterlife by accompanying him into eternity and protecting his soul during its journey through the heavens. The sheer scale of this project reveals something profound about ancient human psychology and the deeply ingrained belief systems that motivated entire civilizations to dedicate enormous resources toward purposes that we would now consider purely spiritual or metaphysical in nature. The terracotta soldiers stand as physical manifestations of a conceptual mechanism that was entirely rational within the cultural and philosophical framework of ancient China, where the boundaries between the material and spiritual worlds were understood not as completely separate but as continuous and interconnected, and where the preparation for death and the afterlife was considered just as important, if not more so, than the management of earthly affairs during one's lifetime. The emperor believed that death was not an ending but a transition, and that maintaining one's status, power, and protection in the afterlife required the same material infrastructure and military organization that one required during life, which led to the logical conclusion that constructing an eternal army of warriors made perfect sense within this worldview. What remains fascinating is how this belief system, despite being entirely disconnected from our modern scientific understanding of consciousness, death, and the nature of reality, has persisted across centuries and continues to capture our imagination and inspire reverence in contemporary visitors who stand before these ancient figures, not necessarily because we share the emperor's metaphysical beliefs, but because we recognize in them a testament to human dedication, artistic mastery, and the universal human drive to transcend mortality through the creation of enduring works. And so we have essentially normalized and recontextualized this elaborate spiritual project as an archaeological marvel and artistic achievement, rather than questioning the fundamental illogic of its original purpose, which demonstrates how ancient misconceptions about reality can be preserved and celebrated long after their original meaning has become obsolete. Yet perhaps this reframing is not merely a distortion, but rather a deeper truth, that the Terracotta Army's significance transcends its original purpose, and in preserving these warriors we honor not the emperor's quest for immortality, but rather humanity's perpetual need to create meaning through material form, to leave behind physical evidence that we existed, that we mattered, and that our hands shaped something that would outlast our brief mortality. In this sense, the Terracotta Army becomes a mirror held up to ourselves, reflecting our own anxieties about impermanence and our own desperate hope that the things we build, whether monuments of clay or digital legacies, might somehow survive us and whisper to distant generations that we were here, that we dreamed, that we mattered. And in this way, every tourist who walks through those underground chambers, photographing these silent warriors with their modern devices, becomes part of an unbroken chain of meaning-making that stretches back millennia, each generation finding in these figures a reflection of their own deepest preoccupations, whether the emperor's spiritual immortality, the archaeologist's hunger for knowledge, or our contemporary obsession with leaving digital footprints that might persist long after our bodies have returned to dust. Imagine standing beneath the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever constructed, a structure that has remained intact for nearly 2,000 years, while countless other buildings from that era have crumbled into dust and archaeological fragments. The Pantheon in Rome presents one of the most perplexing mysteries of ancient engineering, a dome measuring 142 feet in diameter that rises majestically above the city streets, seemingly defying everything we understand about material properties and structural limitations. When Roman engineers poured this massive concrete mixture during the reign of Hadrian in the 2nd century, they were working with a material composition that modern scientists struggled to fully comprehend for centuries. A concrete that appears to improve with age rather than deteriorate as conventional wisdom would predict. The dome itself gradually decreases in thickness from approximately 22 feet at the base to just under 4 feet near the central opening, the oculus, which serves simultaneously as the only light source within the building and as a deliberate structural solution that reduces weight and allows thermal expansion. The concrete used in the Pantheon contains volcanic ash from Puteoli, a material called pozzolanic ash that undergoes a slow chemical transformation when exposed to moisture and carbon dioxide, actually strengthening the structure over centuries rather than weakening it as modern concrete typically does. This extraordinary durability emerges from a mechanism that most ancient builders likely did not fully understand on a scientific level, yet somehow intuitively grasped through experimentation and observation, a pattern of trial and error that eventually produced results that surpassed our contemporary engineering knowledge for nearly 1900 years. Modern engineers studying the Pantheon have discovered that the ancient Romans achieved their success through several interconnected strategies, including the use of lightweight volcanic pumice in the upper portions of the dome to reduce overall weight, a graduated concrete mixture that became lighter toward the crown, and an internal framework of brick arches that distributed the enormous structural stresses in ways we are only now beginning to fully comprehend through computer modeling and advanced structural analysis. What makes this achievement particularly bewildering is that despite our modern understanding of materials science, reinforced concrete, and structural engineering, we have somehow allowed the knowledge and techniques of ancient Roman builders to slip into obscurity, treating their accomplishments as mysterious anomalies rather than as carefully developed systems worthy of continued study and perhaps even emulation in contemporary construction. The Pantheon persists as a testament to the reality that sophistication and understanding are not exclusively the products of modern science, that ancient civilizations possessed forms of empirical knowledge that bypassed formal theoretical frameworks, and that we continue to construct our buildings with approaches that will likely prove less durable than the methods developed 2 millennia ago by craftsmen whose names we will never know and whose systematic approaches we have largely forgotten. The irony deepens when we consider that modern concrete structures require constant maintenance and reinforcement, their lifespans measured in decades rather than millennia, while the Pantheon's dome continues to shed rain and bear weight with the same quiet competence it demonstrated when Hadrian's engineers first removed the wooden formwork and stepped back to witness what they had created. Yet perhaps the most humbling lesson the Pantheon offers is not merely that ancient builders surpassed us in durability, but that they understood something fundamental about working with materials that we have forgotten in our rush toward innovation, that patience, observation, and respect for a material's true nature often yields results far superior to our assumptions about progress and technological advancement. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, known in antiquity as the Pharos of Alexandria, stood on the island of Pharos in the harbor of Alexandria, Egypt, and represented one of the most ambitious architectural and technological achievements of the ancient world, rising somewhere between 350 and 450 feet into the Mediterranean sky, making it taller than most structures that existed during its era and visible from distances of up to 30 miles across open water on clear nights. The tower itself was constructed with 3 distinct sections stacked vertically upon one another, each tapering slightly as it ascended, with the lowest section being square in shape, the middle section being octagonal, and the uppermost section being cylindrical, all working together to create a structure of remarkable elegance and engineering precision that would influence lighthouse design for centuries to come. What made this lighthouse genuinely extraordinary from a technological standpoint was not merely its impressive height or its elegant proportions, but rather the sophisticated system by which it projected light across the harbor and out toward distant ships, accomplished through the use of a massive mirror system positioned at the very top that could reflect the light of a fire or potentially the light of the sun itself across remarkable distances, with some ancient historians claiming that this mirror could project light so far that it was visible on the coast of Asia Minor. The psychological mechanism underlying the obsession ancient peoples had with the Lighthouse of Alexandria appears rooted in humanity's fundamental need to extend control over chaos and danger, particularly the chaos of the sea, and the way that light itself functions as a universal symbol of guidance, safety, and human dominion over darkness. Explaining why this particular structure captured the imagination of ancient writers and scholars so completely that descriptions of it became almost mythologized over time. The notion that a single structure could assert such influence over a natural hazard as treacherous as the Mediterranean Sea represented an intoxicating proposition to the ancient mind, suggesting that through sufficient ingenuity and effort, humans could overcome even the most formidable obstacles that nature presented to commerce and communication. What remains peculiar is how the Lighthouse of Alexandria persists in modern consciousness as a symbol of technological achievement, despite the fact that the actual mechanics of how its mirror system functioned remain somewhat unclear and contested among historians. Yet we continue to venerate it as though we possess complete understanding of its operation, revealing how we have normalized a kind of selective admiration that does not require complete knowledge to function. Allowing ancient structures to retain their status as technological marvels, even when our comprehension of them remains partial and speculative. This phenomenon of admiring what we do not fully understand extends beyond ancient architecture into how we construct modern mythologies around historical achievement, where the gap between fact and legend becomes so compressed that the structure itself becomes less important than the cultural narrative it has come to represent, transforming the pharaohs from a functional beacon into an eternal symbol of human ambition that transcends the material reality of its existence. In this way, the Lighthouse of Alexandria joins a peculiar category of historical monuments whose cultural significance has become entirely unmoored from their practical function, existing now primarily as a repository for our collective anxieties about loss, obsolescence, and the fragility of human accomplishment against the relentless forces of time and natural destruction. The Colossus of Rhodes was an enormous bronze statue depicting the Greek sun god Helios, constructed on the Greek island of Rhodes around the year 280 before the Common Era, standing approximately 108 feet tall, making it one of the tallest structures of the ancient world, and ranking among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a designation that itself speaks to humanity's profound need to categorize and immortalize our greatest technological achievements. The statue was built to commemorate Rhodes' victory in a military siege, and its construction required the coordination of hundreds of workers, vast quantities of bronze and iron, an innovative pulley system that allowed workers to raise enormous bronze plates to astonishing heights, and the mathematical and engineering knowledge to ensure that such a massive structure could stand upright and stable against the relentless Mediterranean winds. The Colossus remained standing for only 56 years before an earthquake toppled it around the year 226 before the Common Era, leaving behind broken pieces that lay on the ground for nearly 9 centuries. What is psychologically fascinating about the Colossus of Rhodes is how it represents humanity's fundamental impulse to build monuments not merely as functional structures, but as statements of power, religious devotion, and technological prowess, demonstrating that even in ancient times we were driven by the same motivations that drive us to construct skyscrapers and space stations today. The ancient world possessed limited understanding of structural engineering compared to our modern knowledge, yet they attempted to build a statue so large that contemporary observers questioned whether it was even possible, suggesting that the psychological drive to create monumentally exceeded the rational calculation of whether such a project served any practical purpose. The fact that the Colossus stood for only a few decades before destruction was inevitable, given the seismic activity in the Mediterranean region, seems almost irrelevant to the ancients who built it, as if the act of creation and the symbolic power it represented were more important than durability or utility. Even more intriguing is how we have normalized this behavior across human civilization, continuing to build massive, expensive structures that push the boundaries of engineering capability not because they solve practical problems, but because they represent human ambition and capability, and we accept this as a reasonable use of resources and effort, viewing such monuments not as wasteful, but as noble achievements that define civilizations and inspire future generations to reach even higher. The Colossus endures in our collective memory not as a functional achievement, but as a symbol of human defiance against impermanence, reminding us that we build not always to last, but to declare that we were here, that we dared, and that our ambitions transcended the practical constraints of our time. In this light, the Colossus of Rhodes becomes less a monument to engineering and more a monument to meaning-making itself. Our species' distinctive ability to transform bronze and stone into vessels of significance that outlast their physical forms by millennia, ensuring that long after the statue crumbled into fragments, its idea remained intact and unforgotten. The broken pieces of the Colossus, which were eventually sold off as scrap metal centuries later, thus completed a poignant cycle, transformed from a symbol of eternal glory into mere commodity. Yet paradoxically, this destruction and dispersal only amplified its legend, proving that monuments need not survive physically to achieve immortality in the human imagination. One of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the ancient world emerged not from necessity alone, but from the ingenious application of a principle so counterintuitive that it seems to defy the very laws of nature that govern water itself. The Romans, in their tireless pursuit of bringing fresh water across vast distances to their cities, developed an extraordinary system known as the siphon, a device that allowed water to flow uphill in defiance of gravity, climbing over mountains and valleys before descending again to its destination. This mechanism depended entirely on the principle of air pressure and the weight of water columns, creating what appeared to observers at the time as pure magic, a technological sleight of hand that seemed impossible without divine intervention or mystical forces. The siphon worked by creating an inverted U-shaped pipe, where water was introduced at one end, filling the entire tube and creating a continuous column that, once primed, would continue flowing downward on the opposite side, as long as the intake remained submerged and the outlet remained lower than the source. The ancient engineers who designed these systems understood intuitively, without the benefit of modern physics terminology or mathematical equations, that air pressure pushing down on the water surface at the intake point would support a column of water up and over the high point, allowing gravity to pull the water down the descending side with such force that it would maintain the flow indefinitely. These siphons were essential components of major Roman aqueducts, particularly in regions where valleys or depressions in the terrain made it impossible to maintain the gentle downward gradient that gravity-driven flow required, and their implementation represents a sophisticated understanding of hydraulic principles that would not be formally articulated in scientific terms for nearly 2,000 years. What remains psychologically fascinating about these ancient siphons is how thoroughly they exemplified the Roman ability to transform theoretical understanding into practical engineering, taking a principle that seems counterintuitive at first encounter and normalizing it so completely that it became simply another tool in their architectural repertoire, as routine and unremarkable as a simple channel cut through stone. The fact that water could be made to climb, to rise above its starting point before falling again, required a complete reimagining of what water was capable of doing. And yet once Roman engineers had demonstrated that it worked reliably and consistently, the marvel transformed into mundane utility, and generations of people living in cities fed by siphon-carrying aqueducts never questioned the impossibility they witnessed daily in their abundance of fresh running water. The aqueduct of Pont du Gard in southern France and the system serving Rome itself relied on these siphons to traverse otherwise impassable terrain, their subterranean pipes carrying millions of gallons daily through inverted arches and hidden conduits, a testament to engineering that functioned so seamlessly that its brilliance became invisible to those who benefited from it most. In this way, the siphon encapsulates the highest achievement of Roman engineering, not monuments of visible grandeur, but solutions so effective that they dissolve into the background of ordinary life. Yet perhaps this invisibility was the ultimate measure of their success. A civilization that could sustain 1 million people in Rome itself through the reliable delivery of fresh water via siphoned aqueducts had transcended the need to celebrate the mechanism, for the water itself, cool, abundant, and taken for granted, became the only monument that truly mattered. In the arid deserts of Persia, where summer temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit and the air seemed to shimmer with relentless heat, ancient engineers developed an ingenious method of preserving ice throughout the year in structures called yachtals, or ice houses, which represented a remarkable triumph of thermal engineering that persisted for nearly 2,000 years and continues to astonish modern scientists with its elegant simplicity and stunning effectiveness. These buildings, which still stand in various states of preservation across Iran and the surrounding regions, were constructed using thick mud brick walls, often rising in dome or vault shapes that naturally distributed weight and stress, while creating insulated chambers deep beneath ground level where the temperature remained perpetually cool even during the hottest months of summer. The process began each winter when water was diverted from nearby sources into large shallow pools adjacent to the ice house structure. And during the freezing nights of the Persian winter, this water would freeze into solid ice that workers would then harvest, cut into massive blocks, and transport into the underground chambers where it would be stacked carefully in layers and insulated with sawdust, straw, or other organic materials that reflected heat and created air gaps to prevent melting. The architectural genius lay in the integration of wind towers called badgers, which were tall vertical structures with openings on multiple sides that captured cool breezes from the upper atmosphere and funneled them down into the ice storage chambers, creating a continuous circulation of cool air that maintained temperatures well below freezing point year-round, allowing ice that had been cut and stored in December or January to remain solid and usable for chilling beverages, making ice cream. And preserving food through the scorching summer months when such luxuries would otherwise be completely impossible. The psychological appeal of this technology was profound, as it allowed wealthy Persian households and nobles to possess something that seemed almost miraculous in the context of desert living: the ability to enjoy cold refreshments when the external world was unbearably hot, creating a stark contrast that would have felt genuinely magical to those experiencing it for the first time. What makes this technology particularly fascinating from a conceptual standpoint is how it required no fuel, no moving mechanical parts beyond human labor, and no complex mathematical calculations. Yet it achieved results that would not be replicated by modern mechanical refrigeration until the 19th century, suggesting that the ancients understood thermodynamic principles through pure observation and experimentation rather than through formal scientific education. The persistence of these ice houses, despite the development of mechanical refrigeration in the modern era, speaks to both their cultural significance and their reliability, as these structures continued operating in parts of Iran well into the 20th century because they remained more cost-effective than purchasing and maintaining ice-making machinery, and because communities had built their entire seasonal rhythms and culinary traditions around the availability of ice produced by these remarkable buildings, creating a form of cultural inertia that outlasted the obsolescence of the technology itself. Today, the remaining yachtals stand as silent testaments to human ingenuity in the face of environmental constraints, with some structures in Isfahan and Yazd now preserved as museums or historical monuments, where visitors can descend into their cool chambers and experience firsthand the ingenious simplicity of a technology that solved one of ancient Persia's greatest challenges through observation, imagination, and the patient application of natural physical laws. When we examine the archaeological evidence of construction sites in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, we find compelling evidence that massive cranes operated by human power were used to lift stone blocks weighing many tons into precise positions high above ground level. Yet the specific mechanisms by which these cranes functioned remain one of the most perplexing mysteries in the history of engineering. The ancient Romans, in particular, left us detailed written accounts through Vitruvius describing sophisticated crane systems that utilized counterweights, pulleys, and intricate rope configurations. And when we study the physical remains of buildings like the Colosseum or the Pantheon, the positioning of massive architectural elements speaks unmistakably to the existence of lifting technology far more advanced than simple ramps or manual labor alone could have achieved. Archaeological digs have uncovered what appear to be treadwheel mechanisms, evidence of pulley systems with multiple mechanical advantages, and strategic anchor points carved directly into stone blocks that would have served no purpose except as attachment points for lifting apparatus. Yet despite this tangible physical evidence literally carved into the ancient world around us, we often find ourselves puzzled by how such technology could have emerged without the industrialization we associate with mechanical advancement in modern times. The psychological mechanism at work here is fundamental to how we understand technological development, for we tend to assume that mechanical sophistication requires electricity, metallurgical precision, and mass manufacturing, when in reality the principles governing levers, pulleys, and mechanical advantage are timeless mathematical truths that any sufficiently motivated civilization could discover through experimentation and observation of natural phenomena. Human ingenuity is remarkable in its consistency across cultures and time periods, and when faced with the practical problem of moving enormous weights, ancient engineers simply applied logical thinking to the solutions available within their material constraints, using wood, rope, and human muscle power configured in increasingly clever arrangements. What makes this particularly fascinating is how thoroughly we have normalized our assumption that technological capability must correlate with how we define progress. So when confronted with evidence that ancients possessed sophisticated mechanical knowledge, we often unconsciously downplay its significance or seek alternative explanations that feel more compatible with our narrative of gradual technological advancement. Yet the cranes of antiquity stand as undeniable testament to the fact that human beings have always possessed the capacity for mechanical innovation when necessity demanded it. And the absence of written documentation in many cultures does not diminish the reality of engineering achievement that persists in stone and marble across millennia. The lifting platforms discovered at the Temple of Jupiter Baalbek, where blocks weighing over 800 tons were positioned with geometric precision, exemplify this principle. No written manual survives to explain their construction, yet the architectural result itself constitutes an indelible record of the knowledge required to achieve it, reminding us that sometimes the greatest documentation of human capability is not found in words, but in the enduring monuments that continue to perplex and inspire us across the centuries. And yet perhaps the most humbling lesson these ancient cranes offer us is not about their mechanical sophistication, but rather about the limitations of our own perspective, for we stand in the presence of their achievements, measure and analyze them, and still struggle to fully comprehend how human determination and rational problem-solving could accomplish such feats without the technological scaffolding we have come to believe is necessary. A gap that reveals more about the boundaries of our modern imagination than it does about any deficiency in ancient capability. In the ancient Mediterranean world, particularly within Hellenistic Egypt and Greece, there existed a collection of mechanical devices housed within temples that were designed to perform specific functions seemingly without human intervention. And these devices, documented by figures such as Heron of Alexandria in the 1st century CE, included doors that opened automatically when fires were lit upon altars, water pumps that dispensed liquids at predetermined moments, and mechanical statues that moved their limbs or appeared to speak during religious ceremonies, all of which were powered by simple but ingeniously arranged systems of weights, pulleys, gears, and the expansion of heated air within sealed chambers. The priests and engineers of these temples understood fluid dynamics and mechanical advantage in ways that seem almost impossible given the technological constraints of their era, and they leveraged these principles to create devices that genuinely astonished observers who witnessed them, though the mechanisms themselves, while clever, relied entirely on natural forces such as thermal expansion, gravitational pull, and water displacement rather than any supernatural or electrical power source. Yet despite the complete understanding that modern scholarship has achieved regarding how these devices functioned, what becomes psychologically fascinating is the way ancient observers processed what they were seeing, as they lived in a worldview where the boundary between mechanical causation and divine intervention was far more porous than our own. And therefore a door that opened automatically upon the lighting of a sacred fire could simultaneously be understood as both a technical marvel and a manifestation of divine will, with these two explanations not only coexisting but actually reinforcing one another in the minds of believers. The temple automaton thus served a dual purpose that modern engineers struggle to fully appreciate, functioning as both a practical mechanism and a theological statement, and the priests who maintained these devices understood perfectly how they worked mechanically, while simultaneously leveraging the psychological impact of their mysterious operation to deepen religious devotion and reinforce priestly authority within their communities. What persists in our understanding of these devices is a tendency to be surprised by their existence, as if ancient people were either more primitive than we assume or more sophisticated in ways we cannot fully grasp, when in fact they simply operated within a different epistemic framework where mechanical ingenuity and religious meaning were not opposed categories, but rather complementary dimensions of the same phenomenon. The temple automaton reminds us that the division between technology and spirituality, between the mechanical and the meaningful, between engineered function and symbolic purpose, is itself a relatively recent invention of our own culture, and that ancient peoples were perfectly capable of creating sophisticated mechanical systems while simultaneously understanding them through frameworks that we have largely abandoned. Which means that our difficulty in fully comprehending their worldview may say more about the limitations of our current categorization systems than it does about any limitations in their understanding. To witness a temple automaton in action was to experience a moment where causation itself became ambiguous. The observer could trace the mechanics if they possessed the knowledge, yet the experience of witnessing it remained genuinely wondrous, suggesting that awe and understanding are not mutually exclusive states, but rather can deepen one another when we recognize that the most profound human achievements often exist precisely at the intersection where technical mastery meets symbolic resonance. The Chinese compass, known as the lodestone compass or the magnetic compass, as it would eventually become known throughout history, emerged during the 11th century as one of humanity's most transformative navigational tools. Yet its origins lie not in the deliberate pursuit of maritime navigation, but rather in the spiritual and divinatory practices of ancient Chinese culture. The early compasses were crafted from naturally magnetized iron ore called lodestone, which possesses an inherent magnetic polarity that causes it to align itself with the Earth's magnetic field. And Chinese scholars and craftspeople discovered that when this material was carved into the shape of a spoon or ladle and balanced upon a polished bronze surface, it would consistently point toward the south, a direction of great spiritual significance in Chinese cosmology and feng shui philosophy. What began as a divination instrument, used by geomancers and fortune-tellers to determine auspicious building placements and burial sites, gradually transformed into something far more practical and revolutionary, as successive dynasties recognized the navigational potential of this mysterious force that seemed to defy conventional explanation. Since no one could actually see what was moving the compass needle or understand the invisible field that governed its behavior. The psychological mechanism underlying the widespread adoption of compass technology involved a gradual shift from viewing the compass as a mystical tool imbued with spiritual power to recognizing it as a practical instrument governed by natural laws. Yet even as this transition occurred, there remained a persistent element of wonder and incomprehension surrounding how and why the device functioned, creating a fascinating paradox wherein sailors and explorers of the Song dynasty and beyond used the compass with absolute confidence and dependence, while simultaneously possessing only vague and incomplete understanding of its underlying mechanisms. The compass technology spread along trade routes to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe, where it catalyzed the age of exploration and fundamentally restructured human civilization by enabling long-distance oceanic voyages that would have been impossible with traditional navigation methods. Yet the remarkable aspect of this technology's persistence and dominance lies in how humanity quickly became so accustomed to using the compass that we largely ceased to question or marvel at its operation, treating it as commonplace equipment, despite the fact that it relies upon an invisible planetary phenomenon that remains genuinely difficult to comprehend on an intuitive level. The normalization of compass technology demonstrates how readily humans accept tools and technologies whose mechanisms they do not fully understand, provided that those tools function reliably and produce consistent results, suggesting that our species possesses a remarkable capacity to integrate mysterious forces into our daily lives without requiring complete comprehension. And this pattern would repeat countless times throughout subsequent centuries, as technology continued to advance and become increasingly removed from direct human sensory experience and understanding. The Chinese compass thus stands as a historical watershed moment, marking the precise point at which humanity began its long journey toward dependence upon technologies that function as black boxes, reliable and indispensable, yet fundamentally opaque to the users who rely upon them most desperately, a pattern that would accelerate exponentially through electricity, radio waves, and ultimately the digital algorithms that now invisibly govern much of modern existence. The invention of gunpowder represents one of history's most consequential accidents, emerging not from deliberate weapons research, but from the innocent pursuit of immortality by Chinese alchemists during the 9th century, who were searching for an elixir that might grant eternal life to their imperial patrons, and in their systematic experimentation with various combinations of sulfur, charcoal, and potassium nitrate. They stumbled upon a mixture that did not grant longevity, but instead produced an explosive reaction of remarkable intensity. The earliest Chinese texts documenting this discovery reveal that alchemists initially viewed the explosive properties as a dangerous byproduct. a mishap in their laboratory work rather than a revolutionary military technology. Yet over subsequent decades and centuries, military strategists began to recognize the tactical advantages that this volatile mixture could provide. And they gradually transformed what was essentially a failed experiment in eternal life into the foundational technology for cannons, firearms, and explosive weapons that would fundamentally reshape warfare across every continent. What makes this historical trajectory particularly fascinating is how the accidental nature of the discovery created a kind of cognitive dissonance in early Chinese military thinking, where gunpowder was simultaneously understood as a tool born from alchemical failure, and yet increasingly deployed as though it represented some kind of intentional technological breakthrough. And this psychological gap between accident and achievement gradually closed as generations passed, and gunpowder became so thoroughly integrated into military practice that few remembered or cared about its humble origins in the search for magical immortality. The persistence of this technology, despite its accidental genesis, reveals something profound about human innovation, namely that our most transformative breakthroughs often arrive not from careful planning, but from the collision of different intellectual pursuits, from the willingness to explore combinations without predetermined outcomes, and from the capacity to recognize potential in unexpected places. Yet we have developed elaborate historical narratives that frame such discoveries as inevitable steps in humanity's technological progress, thereby erasing the contingency and sheer luck that characterizes so many pivotal moments. And we tell stories about Chinese military genius when the truth is far more complex and paradoxical, involving alchemists seeking immortality, accidental explosions, gradual recognition of applications, and eventually the normalization of a technology that emerged from complete accident into one of history's most consequential inventions. This pattern of accidental innovation repeating throughout history, from penicillin discovered through contaminated bacterial cultures to the post-it note emerging from a failed adhesive experiment, suggests that we might deliberately cultivate conditions for productive accidents rather than insisting on rigid adherence to predetermined research objectives. And that the greatest impediment to transformative discovery may be our conviction that progress requires intentionality rather than our willingness to follow unexpected chemical reactions, surprising experimental failures, and serendipitous collisions of ideas wherever they might lead. Yet the irony deepens when we consider that gunpowder's accidental discovery ultimately demonstrated the very principle it seemed to contradict, that the pursuit of one goal, immortality, inadvertently created the means for mass death, suggesting that history's greatest innovations often arrive wrapped in paradox, their consequences both magnificent and terrible, their origins both humble and transformative. The invention of papermaking in China during the 2nd century CE represents one of those peculiar moments in human history where a practical solution to a genuine problem became so elegant that it fundamentally transformed civilization in ways its inventors could never have anticipated. And yet what makes this technology truly bizarre is how completely it displaced all previous writing surfaces across the known world with such thoroughness that we have nearly forgotten the profound strangeness of the transition itself. Before paper emerged from Chinese workshops, the Mediterranean world relied extensively on parchment, which was made from animal skins laboriously claned, stretched, and treated, a process so expensive that only the wealthiest institutions and individuals could afford to maintain written records, while in Egypt papyrus served a similar function, requiring the harvesting of papyrus plants that grew only in specific regions, making the material geographically limited and increasingly scarce as trade disrupted these supply chains. The Chinese innovation involved discovering that plant fibers, particularly from mulberry bark, hemp, and linen scraps, could be reduced to a pulp through soaking and beating, then suspended in water and filtered onto a permeable screen, allowing the water to drain while the fibers matted together into a cohesive sheet that could be pressed and dried into a smooth, writable surface. What emerged from this process was not merely a cheaper alternative to existing materials, but rather a fundamentally different substance that possessed unique properties neither parchment nor papyrus could match. It was lightweight, flexible, relatively uniform in texture, could be manufactured at scale with renewable resources, and importantly, it could be produced in virtually any location where suitable plant materials existed, which meant that once the technology spread, the monopolistic geographic advantages previously held by regions producing papyrus or possessing abundant livestock simply evaporated overnight. The psychological mechanism underlying papermaking's rapid conquest of the written world involved what we might call technological obviousness in hindsight, whereby once a superior solution becomes available, all previous methods seem not just inferior, but almost inexplicably primitive to subsequent generations. Yet this feeling of obviousness obscures the genuine innovation required because the Chinese had to discover through experimentation that certain plant fibers possess the correct dimensional structure and bonding properties to create a surface suitable for writing. And further, they had to develop the specific mechanical processes and chemical treatments that would produce consistent results. Knowledge that accumulated gradually through generations of craftspeople refining their techniques rather than through any single eureka moment. What makes this technology particularly bizarre in retrospect is the degree to which its success was not inevitable, but rather contingent upon several converging factors. The availability of suitable plant materials in China, the development of brush-based writing that could work effectively on the slightly more absorbent surface that paper provided compared to rigid materials, the existence of strong demand for writing materials among expanding bureaucratic structures in China that incentivized further refinement of the technology, and perhaps most crucially, the fact that paper proved so superior in nearly every practical dimension that resistance from existing industries manufacturing alternative writing surfaces proved entirely ineffective. Deep beneath the archaeological layers of Crete, researchers have uncovered an infrastructure so sophisticated that it challenges our fundamental assumptions about when human civilization truly mastered the basics of sanitation and water management. The Minoan civilization, which flourished between 3000 and 1100 BCE, constructed an elaborate system of pipes, channels, and drainage systems that would not be matched again in Europe for nearly 2,000 years. A gap so profound that it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that technological advancement is neither linear nor inevitable, and that entire civilizations can lose knowledge that their ancestors possessed. The palace complexes at Knossos and Phaistos contained terracotta pipes that were carefully fitted together to transport water from mountain sources down into the settlements, distributing it to bathing areas, fountains, and other domestic spaces with a degree of intentionality that reveals a culture deeply invested in the concept of personal hygiene and public wellness. These pipes were not crude approximations, but rather precision-engineered conduits, some featuring a sophisticated system of overlapping sections that allowed for flexibility during earthquakes, a practical consideration that suggests the Minoans understood their environment so deeply that they built resilience directly into their infrastructure. What makes this discovery psychologically disorienting is that these plumbing systems emerged in a pre-industrial society without the mathematical frameworks or industrial machinery we associate with such achievements. Yet they functioned with an elegance that modern observers struggle to explain without defaulting to romantic notions of lost advanced civilizations or the inverse assumption that we are somehow overestimating the sophistication of these ancient engineers. The Minoan civilization normalized the idea that water management was not a luxury for elites, but a social infrastructure that could be distributed across populations. And this normalization meant that bathing culture, waste disposal, and water access became features of everyday life rather than exceptional privileges, a cultural value that seemed so natural to them that they built it into the very stone and clay of their cities. Yet this knowledge apparently evaporated so completely that subsequent Greek civilizations did not reconstruct comparable plumbing systems until centuries later, suggesting that not only can technological sophistication be lost, but the cultural priorities that enable it can be forgotten entirely, leaving us with the unsettling recognition that what we call progress may be more fragile and context-dependent than our linear narratives of history have taught us to believe. The archaeological record shows us that when the Minoan palaces fell into decline around 1100 BCE, the cultural transmission of plumbing knowledge apparently fractured so completely that the Mediterranean world would spend the next 1,000 years reinventing solutions that Minoan engineers had already perfected. A historical amnesia so profound that it suggests civilization is less a ladder we climb and more a conversation we must actively maintain across generations. One that can fall silent with devastating rapidity. When Roman engineers finally reconstructed urban plumbing systems 2 millennia later, they had to solve problems the Minoans had already answered: the angle of pipes for proper drainage, the materials that could withstand pressure and time, the social organization required to maintain such systems, suggesting that knowledge lost is not merely forgotten, but must be painstakingly rediscovered, each generation believing itself to be innovating when it is often simply remembering. The summer heat in ancient civilizations presented an enormous challenge to human comfort and survival, yet architects and engineers across multiple continents developed remarkably sophisticated cooling systems that functioned without electricity, without mechanical compressors, and without any of the technological apparatus we consider absolutely essential to climate control today. In the deserts of Persia, around 2,000 years ago, builders constructed underground chambers called yakchils that could maintain temperatures near freezing even during the hottest months. Using nothing more than ice harvested during winter, thick mud brick walls, wind towers called badgers that captured cool breezes and directed them downward through vertical shafts, and a series of horizontal tunnels beneath the earth that allowed cool air to circulate and preserve perishable foods indefinitely. The walls of these structures were often several meters thick, providing such superior insulation that the internal temperature would remain constant regardless of the external climate, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of thermal mass and air pressure that predates our modern scientific vocabulary by nearly 2 millennia. Similarly, in ancient Egypt, the Nile Delta residents employed wind catchers and strategic window placements to create cross-ventilation patterns that would cool entire homes, while in India, architects designed underground chambers with small openings that would trap and cool air through evaporative cooling and natural convection, allowing inhabitants to survive temperatures that would otherwise prove lethal. The psychological mechanism underlying this achievement lies in the simple fact that necessity forced careful observation of natural phenomena, and those who paid attention to how water evaporates, how wind moves, how thick walls affect temperature, and how underground spaces remain naturally cool could translate these observations into functional designs that required no imported technology, no complex machinery, and no understanding of thermodynamic equations. Yet despite possessing detailed archaeological evidence of these systems, comprehensive historical documentation, and the ability to replicate their construction with modern materials, contemporary societies have largely abandoned these passive cooling strategies in favor of energy-intensive air conditioning systems that require constant power, regular maintenance, and significant environmental cost. Normalizing the idea that comfort requires active technological intervention rather than intelligent design and patient engineering, a shift that persists even as climate change makes energy efficiency increasingly critical, and even as researchers increasingly recognize that ancient passive cooling methods could provide supplementary or even primary cooling in many modern buildings without any electrical consumption whatsoever. The irony deepens when we consider that modern architects are now conducting expensive research to rediscover principles that were already perfected centuries ago. Wind towers in Dubai's new sustainable buildings mirror Badger designs, evaporative cooling systems are being patented as innovations, and underground thermal storage is marketed as cutting-edge technology, suggesting that the path forward may require us to walk backward through history, extracting wisdom from civilizations that solved these problems through observation rather than consumption. This cyclical rediscovery reveals a humbling truth. The most elegant solutions to environmental challenges often emerge not from technological advancement, but from the constraints that force us to work within natural limits. And in an era when we have finally begun to measure the true cost of our energy consumption, we may find that the ancients were not primitive in their understanding, but rather ahead of us in their wisdom. The lost wax casting process represents one of the most ingenious metallurgical techniques ever developed by human civilization, a method so elegant and effective that it has remained fundamentally unchanged for more than 5,000 years. Originating in ancient Mesopotamia and spreading throughout the Bronze Age world with remarkable consistency across cultures that had no contact with one another. The technique begins with the creation of a detailed model, typically sculpted from beeswax or other wax materials, which serves as the original form for the object being created, whether it be a small decorative figurine, an intricate piece of jewelry, or a complex mechanical component requiring exceptional precision and detail. The artisan would spend considerable time perfecting this wax original, adding fine details and ensuring proper proportions, knowing that every mark and feature would be replicated exactly in the final metal casting. Once the wax model was complete to the craftsman's satisfaction, it would be covered in multiple layers of clay or ceramic material, building up a thick investment mold around the original wax core, with each layer carefully applied and allowed to dry before the next was added. When this outer mold had fully hardened, the entire assembly would be heated in a kiln to temperatures high enough to melt away the wax completely, which would drain out of the mold and leave behind a perfect negative cavity of the original sculpture. This empty space would then be filled with molten metal, typically bronze or other alloys, which would flow into every crevice and detail left by the vanished wax, creating an exact replica of the original form with astonishing fidelity and precision that would be nearly impossible to achieve through any other ancient method. The psychological and technical brilliance of lost wax casting lies in its elegant solution to a fundamental problem in metallurgy: how to create complex, detailed objects in metal without the mechanical limitations of forging or the imprecision of simple pouring methods. The ancient artisans recognized that wax, being a soft and relatively low melting point material, could be worked with precision and detail in ways that metal never could, and that by using this wax as a temporary template, they could effectively transfer their sculptural vision into a permanent metal form. The technique leverages the principle that any cavity can be filled with liquid metal, allowing craftspeople to create undercuts, hollow sections, and intricate details that would otherwise be structurally impossible or prohibitively difficult to manufacture. Ancient civilizations developed this method independently in multiple locations, from the Indus Valley to Egypt to Mesoamerica, suggesting that the underlying logic of the process is intuitive to human problem-solving when one understands the basic properties of wax, clay, and molten metal. The technique required no advanced technology, no machinery beyond a kiln and basic tools, yet it produced results of such sophistication and quality that early collectors and archaeologists sometimes refused to believe ancient artisans could have created certain artifacts without knowledge of modern industrial processes. Today, despite possessing computer-aided design, three-dimensional printing, and numerous other advanced manufacturing technologies, jewelry makers, sculptors, dental laboratories, and precision engineers continue to rely on lost wax casting as their preferred method for creating complex metal pieces, having found that no modern alternative provides the same combination of precision, detail, cost-effectiveness, and artistic control. The process has been refined with modern materials and techniques, such as investment compounds and controlled heating systems, yet the fundamental procedure remains identical to what was practiced in ancient Sumer thousands of years ago, speaking to the remarkable efficacy of the original innovation. The astrolabe stands as one of the most mathematically sophisticated instruments ever created in the ancient world, a delicate brass or bronze disc typically measuring between 3 and 6 inches in diameter, yet capable of performing calculations that would not be replicated by mechanical means for over 1,000 years. These instruments, which emerged from Greek astronomy and were perfected by Islamic scholars between the 8th and 15th centuries, represented a pinnacle of precision engineering that still astonishes modern metallurgists and astronomers when they examine surviving examples in museums across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The construction of a single astrolabe required not merely metalworking skill, but a profound understanding of spherical trigonometry, positional astronomy, geography, and the ability to translate three-dimensional celestial mechanics onto a two-dimensional metal surface through an intricate system of rotating rings, engraved scales, and precisely calibrated sight vanes. What makes the astrolabe particularly bizarre in the context of ancient technology is that these instruments were created during periods of history when most of the population remained entirely illiterate. Yet some craftsmen possessed the mathematical literacy and technical precision to manufacture devices that required understanding concepts from advanced geometry and spherical mathematics. The average user of an astrolabe during the medieval Islamic world or late medieval Europe would rotate the alidade, point it at a celestial body, read the altitude from the limb scale, then consult the rotating star map and mathematical tables engraved on the reverse to determine latitude, predict prayer times, establish astrological charts, or navigate by the stars during long sea voyages. The psychological mechanism underlying the creation and mastery of such instruments relates to how human societies develop specialized knowledge systems within small communities of trained individuals who pass their expertise through decades of apprenticeship, creating pockets of extraordinary technical sophistication that exist almost invisibly within predominantly non-technical populations. A phenomenon we observe throughout history where blacksmiths, architects, navigators, and mathematicians possessed capabilities that seemed almost magical to their contemporaries. The persistence of astrolabe making as a craft, despite its limited practical application compared to simpler astronomical tools, reveals how humans become attached to elegant solutions and refined instruments not merely for their utility, but for the intellectual satisfaction they represent, the same impulse that drives modern scientists to build increasingly complex machines, even when simpler alternatives might accomplish the same basic goal. We have largely normalized our own version of this phenomenon by accepting that highly specialized technical knowledge continues to flourish in universities, research institutions, and technological companies, where individuals spend years mastering systems of thought incomprehensible to the broader population. Much as medieval astrolabe makers spent their entire careers perfecting instruments that only a few hundred educated individuals across entire continents could actually operate, suggesting that the creation of sophisticated technology for limited audiences remains a persistent human drive regardless of era or practical necessity. The astrolabe thus became not merely a tool, but a symbol of intellectual aspiration, its bronze surface reflecting centuries of accumulated knowledge that transformed the abstract mathematics of the heavens into something a trained user could hold in their hand and comprehend. Much as today's particle accelerators or genome sequencers represent our own era's commitment to building instruments of breathtaking complexity purely to extend the boundaries of human understanding. The Mayan civilization developed one of the most sophisticated and accurate calendrical systems in human history, creating multiple interlocking calendars that track time with remarkable precision across different cycles and purposes, including the Tzolk'in cycle of 260 days, the Hob cycle of 365 days, and the long count that measured vast stretches of cosmic time spanning thousands of years into both the past and the future. What makes this system genuinely extraordinary is not merely that it existed, but that it operated on mathematical principles of such complexity that modern astronomers and mathematicians have spent decades analyzing it, only to discover that many of its calculations align with astronomical observations that would not be independently verified by Western science until centuries after the civilization's decline. The Maya tracked the cycles of Venus with such precision that their error rate was extraordinarily minimal, calculating the planet's synodic period to within a few hours across multiple centuries, and they managed this without telescopes, without modern instruments, and apparently without the written mathematical notation systems that we associate with advanced astronomical calculation. Their system was based on vigesimal, or base 20, mathematics rather than the base 10 system most familiar to us, which allowed them to express large numbers and complex calculations in ways that proved especially useful for tracking celestial patterns and temporal cycles that operated across multiple scales simultaneously. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with the Mayan calendar relates to our tendency to project meaning and purpose onto ancient achievements that exceed our expectations for that time period, because we maintain unconscious assumptions about technological and intellectual progress as a linear trajectory that only accelerates as civilizations approach our own era. When we encounter evidence that ancient peoples possessed sophisticated knowledge in specific domains, we experience a kind of cognitive dissonance that we resolve by either dismissing the achievement, attributing it to external influences, or elevating it into something almost mystical or impossibly advanced, rather than accepting that intelligence, observation, and mathematical reasoning are capabilities that humans have possessed throughout history, and that different civilizations chose to apply their cognitive resources to different problems based on their environmental needs and cultural priorities. The Mayan focus on astronomical calendars made perfect sense within their context because celestial cycles directly governed agricultural practices, religious observance, and social organization, meaning their investment in calendrical precision was not an accident or an impossible mystical achievement, but rather a rational response to genuine practical necessities. What persists despite having no logical foundation is the modern cultural narrative that portrays the Mayan calendar as fundamentally different from or more advanced than other ancient calendrical systems, when in fact many civilizations developed sophisticated means of tracking time, including the Egyptian, Babylonian, Chinese, and Hindu systems. Yet we have somehow normalized the Mayan calendar as uniquely mysterious. Particularly in popular culture, where pseudoscientific claims about the calendar predicting apocalypses or containing hidden cosmic knowledge continue to circulate widely, even though these claims have no basis in Mayan texts or astronomical reality, and serve primarily to satisfy our appetite for narratives that transform ancient knowledge into something exotic and incomprehensible rather than impressive precisely, because it was comprehensible and useful to the people who created it. The ancient Babylonians, sometime around the second millennium before the Common Era, developed one of humanity's first systematic approaches to mapping and categorizing the night sky, creating detailed celestial charts that would influence astronomical thinking for thousands of years to come. These remarkable star maps were not merely artistic representations or decorative attempts to beautify the heavens, but rather functioned as practical tools for navigation, agricultural timing, and religious observation, carved into clay tablets and preserved through centuries of displacement and ruin. The Babylonians observed the zodiacal constellations with such precision that they divided the ecliptic into 12 sections, a division so functional and intellectually satisfying that we continue using this exact same system today in our horoscopes and celestial navigation, even though the actual positions of stars have shifted considerably since those ancient observations were first recorded. What makes this achievement particularly remarkable is that the Babylonians accomplished this detailed astronomical mapping without telescopes, without modern mathematical notation, without the benefit of printed references, and without any institutional scientific infrastructure as we might understand it today, relying instead on patient, methodical observation conducted across generations, with knowledge passed down through apprenticeship and careful documentation on increasingly refined clay tablets. The psychological mechanism underlying this ancient technological achievement lies in the fundamental human drive to recognize patterns and impose order upon apparently chaotic natural phenomena, a cognitive tendency so deeply embedded in our species that we cannot help but see faces in clouds, constellations in random stars, and meaningful patterns in the movements of celestial bodies across seasons and years. The Babylonians essentially transformed the disorienting experience of looking up at an apparently infinite and meaningless scatter of pinpoints of light into a coherent, memorable, and navigable system, organizing stellar observations into stories and shapes that could be taught, remembered, and transmitted across generations with relative accuracy. Despite the fact that our modern understanding of astronomy has rendered these ancient star maps obsolete in terms of scientific accuracy, we continue to honor and preserve them. We continue to teach the zodiacal constellations in educational contexts, and we continue to use the Babylonian division of the sky as the fundamental framework for our own contemporary astronomical practice. Normalizing this ancient perspective so thoroughly that most people are entirely unaware of its origin or its peculiar arbitrary nature, accepting the 12 zodiac signs as if they represent some timeless and universal truth about the cosmos rather than one particular civilization's practical solution to a problem of organization and memory. Yet this very invisibility of origin speaks to the profound success of the Babylonian achievement, a system so elegant and practical that it transcended its cultural specificity to become genuinely universal, embedding itself so deeply into human consciousness that we experience it not as an inherited artifact but as an objective feature of reality itself. This transformation of cultural construction into perceived natural law reveals something profound about how human knowledge systems achieve permanence, not through force or explicit instruction, but through such seamless integration into daily practice that their origins become invisible, their contingency forgotten, leaving us to navigate the night sky today using the same mental architecture that shepherds and priests in ancient Mesopotamia developed to make sense of the darkness above them. The Babylonians gave us not just a map of the stars, but a demonstration of how human consciousness can impose meaningful structure on the universe, a lesson that resonates through every act of classification and categorization we undertake in our attempts to understand the world. In the Valley of Mexico, where the Aztec civilization flourished between the 14th and 16th centuries, there existed a remarkable system of agricultural engineering that seems almost impossibly sophisticated when we consider the technological limitations of the era. And these structures, known as chinampas or floating gardens, represented one of the most efficient and ingenious approaches to food production that any ancient culture ever devised. Constructed deliberately in the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco and surrounding waterways, these gardens were built by layering aquatic vegetation, mud, and soil upon rafts or shallow-rooted platforms that appeared to float upon the water's surface, creating fertile islands of cultivation where the Aztecs grew beans, corn, amaranth, and flowers with extraordinary productivity and regularity. The construction process itself reveals a profound understanding of hydrological and agricultural principles, as workers would gather reeds and branches from the lake, binding them together into rectangular frames that measured roughly 30 meters in length and 2.5 meters in width. Then these frameworks would be filled with decomposing vegetation and nutrient-rich mud dredged from the lake bottom, which not only provided immediate fertility, but also served as a natural insulation system that helped regulate soil temperature and moisture levels throughout the growing season, while canals were strategically maintained between each garden plot to allow for water access, human navigation, and the intentional flooding that would replenish nutrients and prevent soil depletion. What makes the chinampa system particularly remarkable is the psychological mechanism that drove its creation and refinement. For the Aztecs were constrained by geography and population pressure, surrounded by water, yet lacking sufficient dry land for traditional agriculture. And rather than viewing this limitation as an insurmountable obstacle, they reframed the problem entirely by transforming what seemed like an impediment into an advantage. Recognizing that water itself could become a resource rather than a barrier, and this conceptual shift allowed them to see floating gardens not as a desperate workaround, but as a fundamentally superior method of farming. Despite the passage of centuries and the arrival of European colonizers who largely destroyed the system, the floating gardens have maintained their presence in the collective memory and in certain remnants like Xochimilco near Mexico City, where some chinampas still function today. And this persistence is particularly fascinating because there is no rational reason why modern industrial agriculture should have abandoned them so thoroughly. Given that ancient studies and contemporary research demonstrate that chinampas produce yields 2 to 7 times greater per unit area than traditional farming methods, require minimal pesticides due to the natural pest management provided by the water channels, and offer remarkable sustainability through their self-renewing nutrient cycles. Yet we have normalized the complete displacement of this technology, accepting industrial monoculture and chemical agriculture as inevitable progress, while the floating gardens remain relegated to historical curiosity and tourist attraction. A testament to how thoroughly we can forget superior solutions when they become obscured by cultural disruption and economic restructuring, and how ancient civilizations sometimes understood the relationship between water, soil, and human need with a clarity that our modern systems, for all their technological advancement, have somehow managed to lose entirely. The ancient Mesopotamians constructed massive stepped pyramid structures called ziggurats that rose prominently from the flat landscape of modern-day Iraq and surrounding regions, with the most famous examples including the Great Ziggurat of Ur, the Ziggurat of Babylon, and various others built throughout the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian civilizations spanning thousands of years. These structures were not tombs like their Egyptian counterparts, but rather served as temples and religious centers where priests and priestesses would ascend the monumental staircases and ramps to reach the sanctuary at the summit, believed to be the dwelling place of the gods and a point of contact between the heavens and the earthly realm below. The ziggurats were typically constructed from millions of mud bricks, stones, and bitumen, with the largest examples reaching heights of over 200 feet, making them visible across vast distances and serving as unmistakable landmarks for travelers, merchants, and pilgrims navigating the ancient world. What makes these structures particularly fascinating from a technological perspective is how the Mesopotamians managed to construct such enormous buildings without possessing wheels specifically designed for heavy construction, without mechanical pulleys in the sophisticated sense that later civilizations would employ, and without the kind of permanent written architectural blueprints that we might expect to find in later periods. Yet they successfully created these geometrically accurate, vertically stacked structures that remained standing for thousands of years, despite the environmental challenges of erosion, weathering, and seismic activity inherent to the region. The psychological mechanism behind the ziggurats' prominence in Mesopotamian society appears rooted in humanity's fundamental desire to create physical manifestations of spiritual aspirations, to construct monuments that bridge the gap between mortal existence and divine consciousness, and to establish permanence in a world characterized by the unpredictability of flooding rivers and shifting political power. Which explains why successive generations of rulers continued to invest enormous resources in either building new ziggurats or maintaining and expanding existing ones. Despite the passage of millennia and the complete transformation of human technology, building practices, and religious frameworks, we continue to construct tall structures motivated by similar psychological impulses. Whether we frame them as skyscrapers, corporate monuments, or public buildings designed to inspire awe and demonstrate human capability. Suggesting that the fundamental human drive to reach upward and create testaments to human achievement that the Mesopotamians expressed through ziggurats remains a persistent and perhaps inescapable element of human civilization. The ziggurats ultimately represent a crucial turning point in human architectural ambition, marking the moment when societies began systematizing the construction of monumental public works as expressions of both religious devotion and political authority, a template that would echo through subsequent civilizations from ancient Egypt to classical Rome and beyond. Demonstrating that the ziggurat's true legacy lies not in its physical form, but in its role as a blueprint for how human communities organize labor, resources, and imagination toward the creation of enduring symbols. The archaeological record shows that ziggurats functioned as centers of economic power as well, with temple complexes managing vast agricultural lands, controlling trade networks, and employing thousands of workers, suggesting that these structures were as much about consolidating institutional authority as they were about reaching toward the divine. Somewhere around 3200 before the Common Era, in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, human beings developed one of history's most transformative technologies, a system of writing that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of civilization itself. And yet this remarkable achievement emerged not from a desire for artistic expression or philosophical documentation, but rather from the deeply practical need to keep track of grain inventories and livestock herds. The Sumerians, confronted with the logistical challenges of managing increasingly complex agricultural surpluses and trade networks, found themselves unable to rely solely upon human memory and verbal tradition to record transactions and property claims, and so they began to press reed styluses into soft clay tablets, creating patterns of wedge-shaped marks that we now call cuneiform, a term derived from the Latin words for wedge and form. What makes this technology genuinely remarkable is not merely that it solved an administrative problem, but that the Sumerians recognized something profound about the relationship between external representation and human cognition, understanding intuitively that information could be transferred from the human mind into a persistent physical medium, stored there indefinitely, and then retrieved and interpreted by other minds at later times or in distant places. The psychological mechanism underlying cuneiform's development reveals a fundamental truth about human consciousness itself, namely that we are creatures who struggle to maintain complex information without external aids, and that our capacity for civilization scales directly with our ability to externalize thought and memory into tangible forms that persist beyond individual mortality. What becomes psychologically fascinating is how quickly cuneiform systems became increasingly elaborate and standardized, with different regional variations and specialized vocabularies developing for different domains of knowledge, suggesting that once humans experienced the liberating power of written language, the pressure to expand and refine the system became almost irresistible. Yet despite the obvious advantages that cuneiform provided, and despite the fact that it persisted for thousands of years across multiple civilizations and language groups, there remains something almost bewildering about how a technology invented to track grain somehow transformed into a vehicle for recording poetry, laws, mathematical calculations, and religious beliefs, as though the original practical impulse somehow awakened something deeper in human consciousness. The normalization of this extraordinary leap from mere record-keeping to comprehensive documentation of human experience happened so gradually and so completely that we have essentially forgotten to marvel at it, accepting as utterly natural and inevitable something that would have been literally incomprehensible to pre-literate peoples, who would have regarded the ability to capture speech itself in clay as something approaching magic or divine intervention. And perhaps that sense of magic was not entirely misplaced, for in learning to write, the Sumerians had indeed performed something close to the impossible. They had found a way to make thought itself durable, to grant human consciousness a kind of permanence that transcends the biological accident of individual existence, transforming ephemeral speech into eternal stone. This capacity to preserve thought beyond the speaker's lifetime meant that knowledge could accumulate across generations, with each scribe building upon the insights of predecessors, creating an intellectual continuity that would have been impossible in purely oral cultures, where each death threatened to erase entire domains of accumulated wisdom. The Roman sewer system, particularly the famous Cloaca Maxima in Rome, represents one of the most sophisticated waste management infrastructures ever constructed in the ancient world. And what makes this achievement particularly remarkable is not merely its engineering prowess, but the conceptual leap required to understand that human waste could be systematically removed from population centers rather than simply accumulated in streets and designated areas. The Cloaca Maxima, which translates to the Great Sewer, was initially built as an open channel during the reign of the Tarquin kings around the 6th century before the Common Era, designed primarily to drain marshes and swampy land rather than to manage human waste. Yet it eventually evolved into an elaborate network that could transport sewage away from the city and into the Tiber River, functioning as a comprehensive system of underground tunnels, pipes, and channels that required constant maintenance and periodic flushing to prevent blockages and overflow. What emerges from studying this system is a fascinating psychological phenomenon wherein the Romans developed a profound understanding that making waste invisible and out of sight was essential to maintaining urban civilization, recognizing intuitively that concentrated populations required mechanisms for separating habitable spaces from the biological byproducts of human existence. The mechanism underlying this innovation was rooted in practical observation and engineering necessity rather than any advanced scientific understanding of disease transmission. Since germ theory would not be developed for nearly 2,000 years, yet the Romans understood through experience and accumulated wisdom that cities without proper waste removal became unhealthy, malodorous, and unpleasant to inhabit, creating a functional understanding that preceded the theoretical knowledge. What persists as genuinely bizarre is how completely normalized this infrastructure became, such that Roman citizens expected functional sewers in their homes and public spaces, with wealthy Romans incorporating private latrines connected to sewer lines into their residential architecture, and the existence of such systems became a marker of civilization and prosperity. The Romans even appointed officials called aediles whose specific responsibility included maintaining sewer infrastructure and ensuring its continued operation, essentially creating bureaucratic frameworks around what we might consider a purely technical problem, demonstrating how deeply embedded waste management became in the social and governmental structures. Despite having no logical reason whatsoever to expect that human societies should expend vast resources and labor on burying their waste underground and transporting it miles away, this practice became so normalized that the absence of sewers in medieval European cities, after the fall of Rome, was actually experienced as a dramatic loss of quality of life rather than merely a return to previous state, suggesting that once humans experienced the convenience and psychological comfort of hidden waste systems, returning to visible sewage became genuinely intolerable. This loss of infrastructure had profound consequences for public health and urban development across Europe for centuries, as cities struggled without adequate sewage systems, until the Victorian era finally rekindled the Roman understanding that civilization itself depends upon the invisible machinery that removes what we produce but cannot bear to see. The remarkable irony is that the Roman sewer system, one of their most enduring achievements, remains largely invisible and unconsidered by modern visitors to Rome, buried beneath streets and buildings, a testament to how completely successful this infrastructure was in accomplishing its fundamental purpose of rendering human waste literally and psychologically absent from daily consciousness. Among the remarkable artifacts that archaeologists have recovered from ancient civilizations, polished bronze mirrors stand as some of the most intriguing examples of technological sophistication. Yet their existence challenges our assumptions about the progression of human knowledge and capability. These mirrors, dating back thousands of years to ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and the Mediterranean cultures, were crafted with such precision and skill that they rival the reflective quality of modern glass mirrors in many ways, and yet we often overlook just how extraordinary this achievement truly was. The process of creating these mirrors required not only an understanding of metallurgy and the properties of bronze as a material, but also an intuitive grasp of optics, surface preparation, and the precise angles at which light would refract and reflect when encountering a polished metal surface. Artisans would begin with bronze ingots, carefully controlling the ratio of copper to tin to achieve the desired properties, then hammer and shape the metal into thin, circular, or rectangular forms, and finally subject these pieces to countless hours of patient polishing using increasingly fine abrasives such as sand, ash, and specially prepared stones, until the surface reached a mirror-like finish capable of producing a clear reflection. What makes this particularly fascinating is that these ancient peoples had no scientific framework for understanding why this worked, no knowledge of wavelengths or the electromagnetic nature of light, and yet through empirical observation and accumulated cultural knowledge, they developed techniques that produced functional mirrors of remarkable quality. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the human tendency to pursue perfection in practical objects through iterative refinement, a process that requires no theoretical understanding but merely patient observation of cause and effect, combined with the motivation to create objects of beauty and utility that would serve both practical and ceremonial purposes. These mirrors became status symbols, religious objects, and tools for personal grooming, which meant that there was constant incentive to improve their quality and refine the techniques of their production. What persists despite our modern understanding of optics is the fundamental mystery of how humans managed to achieve such technical mastery without the scientific apparatus we consider necessary for such work, suggesting that practical knowledge and cultural transmission across generations can accomplish what we often assume requires formal education and theoretical frameworks. And this realization invites us to question what other ancient technologies might represent achievements of comparable sophistication that we have yet to fully appreciate or understand. Indeed, when we examine the bronze mirrors discovered in Shang dynasty tombs or those found in Etruscan burial sites, we find not merely functional objects, but evidence of a sophisticated understanding of material properties and aesthetic refinement that suggests ancient craftspeople possessed an intuitive mastery comparable to that of modern artisans trained in materials science. This recognition fundamentally reshapes our understanding of technological progress, revealing it not as a linear ascent from ignorance to enlightenment, but rather as a cyclical process of loss and recovery, where practical knowledge can flourish independently of the theoretical frameworks we have come to associate with advanced civilizations. The loss of such knowledge during periods of cultural disruption, whether through conquest, migration, or the collapse of trade networks, explains why mirror-making techniques had to be reinvented in some regions, a pattern that appears throughout history and demonstrates that technological sophistication is as fragile as it is impressive, dependent upon the continuous transmission of craft knowledge from master to apprentice across unbroken chains of generations. High in the Andes Mountains, suspended across vast gorges and rushing rivers, the Incan civilization constructed engineering marvels that defied the apparent limitations of their materials and tools, creating rope bridges that spanned distances of up to 150 feet while being woven entirely from grass. Yet these structures remained functional and reliable for centuries, a phenomenon that challenges our modern assumptions about technological sophistication and material strength. The Qhapaq-Nyan road system, which stretched across more than 25,000 miles of mountainous terrain connecting the far-flung reaches of the Incan Empire, depended critically upon these suspension bridges as key junction points, and the most famous of these structures was the Huachuca Bridge, which still stands and functions today in a remote region of Peru, rebuilt annually through a community ceremony that has persisted for more than 5 centuries. The bridges were constructed from thick cables made of iku grass, a hardy alpine grass that grows abundantly at high elevations, and these cables were twisted together with remarkable precision to create structures capable of supporting the weight of laden llamas, soldiers, and administrative officials moving between distant provinces. With each cable measuring as much as 2 feet in diameter and containing thousands upon thousands of individual grass fibers, bound together through techniques that relied entirely upon human labor and traditional knowledge, passed down through generations without written instruction or formal documentation. The psychological mechanism underlying the success of these bridges reveals something profound about the relationship between material properties and human ingenuity. For while modern engineering would immediately dismiss grass as an inadequate building material for such applications, the Incan engineers understood through centuries of empirical observation and practical experimentation that the tensile strength of tightly woven grass fibers, when bundled in sufficient quantity and properly maintained, could rival or exceed that of many other materials available in their environment, and this knowledge emerged not from theoretical calculation, but from direct experience and iterative refinement. The grass cables possessed remarkable flexibility and resilience, actually performing better under certain stress conditions than rigid materials would have, as the slight give in the cables allowed for dynamic load distribution and absorbed the impact of movement across the bridge. And the fact that these bridges required annual reconstruction was not a deficiency, but rather an elegant solution to maintenance and material degradation, transforming what might seem like a weakness into a systematic renewal process that kept the infrastructure in optimal condition while simultaneously reinforcing community bonds through collective labor. The Incan bridge builders recognized that durability was not absolute but relative to the specific environmental context, and by accepting the need for regular replacement and rebuilding, they created a sustainable system that actually required less total material investment over long periods than structures built from more permanent but more brittle materials would have demanded. What persists today as genuinely bizarre is how completely this sophisticated understanding of material science and structural engineering was dismissed and forgotten following the Spanish conquest, as European observers literally could not believe that such bridges existed or could function, viewing them as impossible feats that contradicted their understanding of material properties and engineering principles. And this dismissal continued for centuries, even as the bridges themselves continued their quiet function in remote mountains, serving their communities with unwavering reliability despite being constructed from what European minds classified as worthless grass and primitive technique. Long before the invention of synthetic adhesives and modern manufacturing techniques, human beings faced a fundamental problem that would have seemed almost insurmountable to those living in prehistoric times: how to permanently attach one object to another using only the materials available in their natural environment. Archaeological evidence suggests that Stone Age peoples developed remarkably sophisticated adhesive solutions by experimenting with naturally occurring substances, particularly birch bark tar, which they extracted through a process of controlled heating that required not only technical knowledge, but also a deep understanding of material properties and thermal manipulation. The discovery and refinement of birch bark tar adhesive represents one of the earliest examples of chemical engineering, as ancient peoples learned to heat birch bark in the absence of oxygen, a process that would have required specialized pit kilns or enclosed heating structures. And through this method, they produced a sticky, durable substance that could bind stone tools to wooden handles with surprising effectiveness. What makes this achievement even more remarkable is that there is no evidence that these early peoples understood the chemistry behind what they were doing. They simply observed that heating birch bark in a particular way produced a substance with desirable adhesive properties, and they replicated this process across different regions and different generations, passing the knowledge down through demonstration and practice rather than written instruction. Archaeological sites in Europe, particularly in areas like Scandinavia and the Rhineland, have yielded tools dating back over 80,000 years that show clear evidence of adhesive bonding, with residues of birch bark tar still visible on stone and bone implements, suggesting that this technology was not a rare discovery, but rather a widespread and essential part of Stone Age toolmaking. The remarkable aspect of this ancient adhesive is that it remained largely unchanged for tens of thousands of years. The same basic process, using the same basic materials, was employed by Stone Age peoples across vast geographical distances and temporal spans, indicating that once this technology was discovered, it was so effective and so central to survival that there was little incentive or opportunity to develop alternatives. One might wonder why such ancient peoples would have devoted time and energy to developing complex adhesive technology when they could have simply carved tools from single pieces of stone or bone. But the reality is that composite tools, combining a sharp stone blade with a wooden handle attached via adhesive, were dramatically more effective than single material implements. and this functional advantage would have provided immediate survival benefits that encouraged refinement and transmission of the technique. The psychological mechanism underlying this innovation appears to be rooted in observational learning and experimentation. Early humans recognized that certain natural substances had sticky properties, and through trial and error, they discovered that controlled heating intensified these properties, creating a feedback loop where success encouraged repetition and refinement. This ancient adhesive technology persists in our modern world in surprising ways, as birch bark tar is still used in some traditional craft practices and continues to demonstrate remarkable durability when properly applied, with archaeological samples remaining chemically viable after millennia in the ground. A testament to the effectiveness of a material discovered through nothing more than careful observation and patient experimentation by peoples without any formal scientific training or theoretical framework. The enduring success of birch bark tar also demonstrates that innovation in prehistoric times was not driven by necessity alone, but by a kind of curiosity and systematic problem-solving that we might recognize in modern inventors, suggesting that the human impulse to understand and manipulate materials is perhaps as old as consciousness itself.